A true alpha dies before his pack falls. Those were the final words Frank Pugh's father spoke, his dying breath carrying the weight of 5 generations of leadership. But Frank would discover that you could die 1,000 small deaths, and your pack would still crumble. That honor meant nothing when facing enemies who fought with poison instead of claws. And that the wolves who promised to stand beside you would be the first to step back when the ground beneath your feet finally gave way. Some battles can't be won with devotion alone. This is the story of how an alpha who would have gladly died for his pack had to watch them destroy themselves instead, and learned that sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't death, but being forced to survive the aftermath of faith misplaced. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Stone. Frank Pugh had carried the Alpha Stone for 7 years, and in those 7 years he had never once felt its weight as a burden. The stone itself was small, no larger than a robin's egg, smooth and dark as midnight, shot through with veins of silver that seemed to pulse with an inner light. It hung around his neck on a leather cord his father had braided himself, back when his hands were still steady and his eyes still clear, back before the sickness had hollowed him out from the inside. "The stone doesn't make you alpha," his father had rasped, each word a struggle against the fluid filling his lungs. "It just reminds you what you already are. A servant, a shield, the one who breaks so others don't have to." Frank had been 23 then, barely old enough to understand the weight of that responsibility. Now, at 30, he understood it too well. He stood at the edge of Clearwater Ridge, looking down at the valley where his pack made their home. 43 wolves, ranging from pups barely old enough to shift to elders whose silver fur had earned them respect in 5 territories. 43 souls who depended on him to keep them safe, fed, and protected from the constant threats that prowled the borders of their land. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, but Frank couldn't enjoy the beauty of it. His mind was already running through the day's tasks. Patrol schedules to review, a dispute between 2 families over hunting territory to mediate, supplies to gather for the coming winter, and most pressing, a meeting with the neighboring Moonridge pack to negotiate access to the river that ran between their territories. "You're up early." Frank didn't turn at the sound of the voice. He'd heard Rosalind Travis approaching from 100 yards away, her footsteps deliberate, her breathing controlled. His beta was nothing if not precise in everything she did. "Couldn't sleep," Frank admitted, watching smoke rise from the chimneys below. "Too much to think about." Rosalind came to stand beside him, her auburn hair caught in a tight braid that fell past her shoulders. She was tall for a woman, nearly matching Frank's 6-foot frame, with sharp features and sharper eyes that missed nothing. Where Frank led with his heart, Rosalind led with her mind, a balance that had kept their pack stable through countless challenges. "The Moonridge meeting," she said. It wasn't a question. Among other things. Frank finally turned to face her. "Edmund Bright sent another message last night. They're insisting on exclusive river access during the spawning season." Rosalind's jaw tightened. "That's 1/4 of our fresh water supply. We can't agree to that." "I know." Frank ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaustion pulling at him. "But they have twice our numbers and 3 times our territory. If it comes to a fight—" "It won't," Rosalind cut him off, her voice hard with certainty. "Because you'll find a solution. You always do." The confidence in her voice should have reassured him. Instead, it settled like another stone on his shoulders, one more expectation he couldn't afford to fail. "Rosalind," he began, then hesitated. "Do you ever wonder if I'm enough for this?" She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the early light. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Frank, you've given everything to this pack. Your time, your energy, your happiness. You barely sleep. You eat less than the Omega Wolves because you want to make sure everyone else has enough first. You've negotiated peace treaties with 3 separate packs, prevented 2 territory wars, and personally rescued 6 wolves from hunter traps in the last year alone." She paused, her eyes boring into his. "If you're not enough, then enough doesn't exist." The words should have comforted him. They didn't. Because Frank could see what Rosalind couldn't or chose not to. He could see the way some pack members averted their eyes when he passed. The way conversations would stop when he entered a room. The hushed whispers that followed him like shadows. He'd tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it was paranoia born from exhaustion. But the signs were there, growing more obvious with each passing week. Something was shifting in the pack, some current of dissatisfaction he couldn't quite name or pin down. And despite everything he'd done, everything he'd sacrificed, he could feel them slipping away from him like water through his fingers. "Come on," Rosalind said, breaking into his thoughts. "Breakfast won't cook itself, and you need to eat before the meeting. You look like death warmed over." They made their way down the ridge together, following the worn path that generations of wolves had carved into the hillside. As they approached the central lodge, a massive timber structure that served as both meeting hall and community center, Frank could hear the sounds of the pack waking, children laughing, adults calling greetings to one another, the clatter of pots and pans from the communal kitchen. These were his people, his family, and he would die before he let anything tear them apart. If only he'd known that dying would have been easier than what was coming. Inside the lodge, the morning meal was already underway. Long tables filled with pack members eating, talking, and sharing the easy comfort of people who'd known each other their entire lives. Frank moved through them, offering greetings and asking after family members, checking on injuries and settling minor disputes with the practiced ease of long experience. But he noticed things others might miss. The way Adriana Winters and her mate, Bill Stephenson, stopped talking when he approached their table. The manner in which Kevin Newman, one of his most trusted hunters, found a sudden fascination with his breakfast plate rather than meet Frank's eyes. The hushed conversation between Kayla Warner and Bet Garza that died the moment he came within earshot. Small things, tiny things. Things that individually meant nothing but together formed a pattern that made his stomach clench with unnamed dread. Alpha Frank. A small body collided with his legs, and Frank looked down to find Clifton Post's daughter beaming up at him. She was 6 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. "Good morning, little wolf," Frank said, crouching down to her level. "Shouldn't you be having breakfast?" "I already ate," she announced proudly. "Papa says we're going to the river today to catch fish. Will you come with us?" The simple request, offered with such pure hope, nearly broke something in Frank's chest. This was why he did it, why he carried the weight. For moments like this for children who could ask their alpha to go fishing without fear or hesitation. "I have a meeting today," Frank said gently. "But next week, I promise, we'll catch the biggest fish in the river." She seemed satisfied with this and scampered off to rejoin her family, leaving Frank kneeling in the middle of the lodge with that familiar ache in his chest, the one that came from loving something too much to imagine losing it. He stood, his knees protesting, and caught sight of Rosalind watching him from across the room. She nodded toward the door. Time to prepare for the meeting. As Frank made his way through the crowd, a hand caught his arm. He turned to find Dennis Crane, one of the pack's elders, his weathered face creased with concern. "Walk with me," Dennis said quietly. It wasn't a request. They stepped outside into the cool morning air, moving away from the lodge until they were out of earshot. Dennis was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying Frank with an intensity that made the younger man uncomfortable. "Something's wrong," Dennis finally said. "I can feel it in the pack." "Can you?" Frank's throat tightened. "I've noticed some tension." "Tension." Dennis barked a laugh. "That's one word for it. Frank, I've been part of this pack for 63 years. I've served under 4 alphas, including your father. And I'm telling you now, what I'm feeling isn't just tension. It's rot. Something's poisoning the pack from the inside, and if you don't find it and cut it out soon, there won't be a pack left to save." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" Dennis stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm saying be careful who you trust. I'm saying that even the wolves who smile at you might be sharpening their teeth behind your back. And I'm saying that your father's mistake was believing that being good would be enough to keep wolves loyal." He paused, his expression softening with something that might have been pity. "Goodness isn't enough, Alpha. It never has been." Before Frank could respond, Dennis turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Frank touched the alpha stone at his chest, feeling its familiar warmth through his shirt. His father's words echoed in his memory. A servant. A shield. The one who breaks so others don't have to. He'd break 1,000 times for his pack. But what did you do when your pack was the thing breaking you? Chapter 2. The Moonridge Compromise. The Moonridge territory began where the valley narrowed into a gorge, marked by ancient stone cairns that had stood for longer than anyone could remember. Frank approached the border with Rosalind at his side and Theodore Davidson, trailing a respectful 3 paces behind, his presence more symbolic than practical. Theodore was young, barely 25, but he'd proven himself a skilled diplomat in previous negotiations. More importantly, he was one of the few pack members who still looked at Frank with something approaching admiration. Small mercies. The meeting place was a clearing halfway between territories, neutral ground that belonged to neither pack. Edmund Bright was already there, standing with his arms crossed and his expression carved from granite. He was a massive man, even by wolf standards, nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that could bear the weight of mountains. His silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a warrior's tail, and scars crossed his face like a roadmap of battles won. Behind him stood 3 wolves, his beta, a woman named Claire Jordan whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded her, Alfredo Hatch, Moonridge's head enforcer, and Jeffrey Cole, who Frank recognized as one of Edmund's most trusted advisors. The numbers weren't lost on Frank. Edmund had brought his inner circle his true power base. It was a message. This negotiation matters. Frank Pugh. Edmund's voice rumbled across the clearing like distant thunder. Punctual as always. Edmund Bright, Frank replied, keeping his tone neutral. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Let's skip the pleasantries. Edmund gestured to a fallen log that had been positioned in the center of the clearing. We both know why we're here. They sat Frank, Rosalind, and Theodore on one side, Edmund and his wolves on the other. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. The river. Edmund began without preamble. During spawning season, my pack needs exclusive access. We're willing to compensate you hunting rights in the eastern woods for the same period. Frank had anticipated this offer. The eastern woods were decent hunting grounds, but they didn't compare to losing a quarter of their water supply during the critical spawning months. The eastern woods are 30 miles from our territory, Frank said carefully. That's a full day's travel for our hunters. Meanwhile, your pack would control the richest fishing grounds during the most abundant season, which is why we need them. Claire Jordan cut in, her voice sharp. Our pack has grown by 18 wolves in the last year. We have pups to feed, nursing mothers who need the protein. Your pack is barely 40 strong. You can afford to share. The words stung, partly because they were true. Moonridge was thriving, while Clearwater struggled to maintain its numbers, but that didn't make the demand fair. Our pack may be smaller, Rosalind said, her voice ice cold. But that doesn't mean we need the resources less. In fact, it means we need them more. Every fish, every deer, every resource matters when you're trying to survive, not just thrive. Edmund's eyes narrowed. Are you calling my pack greedy, Beta Travis? I'm calling your offer unbalanced. Rosalind shot back. You want us to give up our most valuable resource in exchange for hunting grounds that require a full day's travel. That's not compromise, that's exploitation. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alfredo Hatch's hand moved to the knife at his belt, not a threat, but a reminder that it was there. Theodore Davidson tensed beside Frank, ready to shift at the first sign of aggression. This was spiraling out of control. Perhaps, Frank said, his voice cutting through the tension. We're approaching this from the wrong angle. All eyes turned to him. Edmund raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Frank had spent the entire night thinking about this moment, running through scenarios and possibilities until his head ached. The solution had come to him just before dawn, fragile and uncertain, but the only path he could see forward. What if we shared the river? Frank proposed. Not alternating access, but truly shared it. Your pack fishes the northern banks during spawning season. We fish the southern banks. We set catch limits for both packs to ensure the population remains sustainable. And in exchange for accepting those limits, you help us improve our southern hunting grounds, not access to your lands but expertise. Your hunters teach ours better tracking techniques, more efficient preservation methods. Edmund's expression was unreadable. You want us to teach you to be better hunters. I want us to help each other be better, Frank corrected. Your pack has knowledge we lack. We have other strengths. We're excellent with herbal medicine. Our healer, Tammy Wolf, is the best in 3 territories. What if we offered medical support for your pack in exchange for hunting education? He could feel Rosalind's surprise beside him. This wasn't something they'd discussed. But Frank could see the shift in Edmund's expression, the way calculation replaced hostility. Medical support, Edmund repeated slowly. For hunting expertise. And shared river access with sustainable catch limits, Frank added. Both packs benefit, both packs survive. Isn't that better than fighting over scraps? For a long moment, no one spoke. A hawk cried somewhere overhead, its call echoing through the gorge. Frank could hear his own heartbeat, thunderous in his ears. Then Edmund Bright did something Frank had never seen him do before. He smiled. You know what your problem is, Pew? Edmund leaned back, crossing his arms. You're too reasonable, too willing to bend. Any other alpha would have told me to go to hell and prepared for war. But not you. You'd rather find a solution that keeps everyone happy. Frank couldn't tell if that was a compliment or an insult. Is that a yes? He asked carefully. Edmund glanced at Claire Jordan, who gave a barely perceptible nod. It's a maybe. I need to discuss it with my pack council. But I'll admit your proposal has merit, more than I expected. He stood, his massive frame blocking out the sun. I'll send word within 3 days. One way or another, you'll have your answer. The meeting concluded with terse farewells and careful formality. As Edmund and his wolves disappeared back into Moonridge territory, Theodore let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. That went better than I expected, he said, relief evident in his voice. The way it started, I thought for sure we'd be at each other's throats. We still might be, Rosalind muttered, but Frank could hear the grudging approval in her tone. But you bought us time. That was smart thinking with the medical exchange. Frank didn't respond. He was watching the path where Edmund had vanished, thinking about that smile. About the words. You're too reasonable. Too willing to bend. Was that true? Was his willingness to compromise a strength or a weakness? His father had been a warrior alpha, the kind who led charges and settled disputes with shows of force. Frank had always tried to be different, to lead with wisdom instead of violence, to build bridges instead of walls. But maybe Dennis Crane was right. Maybe goodness wasn't enough. Alpha. Frank turned to find Theodore watching him with concern. Sorry, lost in thought. Let's head back. I want to update the pack council before. He stopped mid-sentence. The wind had shifted, carrying a scent that made his blood run cold. Smoke. Not the comfortable wood smoke of cooking fires, but the acrid stench of something burning that shouldn't be. Do you smell that? Rosalind's hand went to her side, where she kept a hunting knife. Frank was already moving, racing back toward their territory with his Beta and Theodore close behind. They crested the ridge in record time, and Frank's worst fears materialized before his eyes. The eastern edge of their territory was burning. Not a wildfire, the flames were too controlled, too deliberate. Someone had set this fire intentionally, targeting the storage sheds where they kept winter supplies, dried meat, preserved vegetables, medical herbs, everything they'd spent months gathering and preparing. Wolves from the pack were already fighting the blaze, forming bucket chains from the river and beating at flames with wet blankets. But Frank could see it was a losing battle. The sheds were already half consumed, flames licking 40 feet into the air. He shifted without thinking, his human form melting into his wolf, a large gray beast with the alpha stone somehow remaining around his neck even in this form, pulsing with silver light against his dark fur. He plunged into the chaos, helping to coordinate the firefighting efforts, physically pulling wolves back when they got too close to collapsing structures. It took 3 hours to contain the fire. By the time the last flame was extinguished, the eastern storage complex was a smoking ruin. Frank shifted back to human form, his skin covered in soot and ash, staring at the destruction that represented months of work and resources they desperately needed for the coming winter. How did this start? He asked, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. No one answered. The assembled wolves looked at each other, uncertainty and something else, something that looked like guilt flickering across their faces. Well? Frank demanded, letting a hint of alpha command creep into his voice. Someone must have seen something. These sheds don't spontaneously combust. Kayla Warner stepped forward, her face streaked with soot and tears. Alpha, I saw someone. Running away from the sheds right before the fire started. Frank's heart sank. Who? Kayla hesitated, her eyes darting to the other wolves. Several of them looked away. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't see their face clearly. But I think they were wearing pack colors. One of ours, Alpha. The fire was set by one of our own. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sabotage. From within his own pack, Frank looked around at the assembled wolves, 43 souls who were supposed to be family, supposed to be bound by loyalty deeper than blood. And somewhere among them was someone who had just destroyed their winter supplies. Someone who had betrayed everything the pack stood for. Dennis Crane's words echoed in his mind. Even the wolves who smile at you might be sharpening their teeth behind your back. Everyone back to the lodge, Frank ordered, forcing his voice to remain steady even as his world tilted on its axis. Now, we're going to get to the bottom of this. As the pack filed away, Frank caught Rosalind's eye. She looked as shaken as he felt, and for Rosalind to show emotion meant things were worse than he'd feared. This changes everything, she said quietly. Frank touched the alpha stone at his chest, feeling its warmth against his skin. The stone that represented duty, sacrifice, and service. The stone his father had died believing in. No, Frank said, his jaw tight with determination. This changes nothing. Someone wants to tear this pack apart, but I won't let them. We'll find who did this. And we'll fix this. And we'll survive. Because that's what we do. But even as he spoke the words, he could feel them thin and fragile as spider silk, stretched across an abyss he couldn't see the bottom of. And somewhere in that darkness, something was laughing. Chapter 3. The Interrogation. The lodge had never felt so suffocating. Frank stood at the head of the main hall, the alpha stone heavy against his chest, watching as his pack assembled before him. 43 wolves, their faces still marked with soot and exhaustion from fighting the fire. 43 souls, who should have been united in their grief over the lost supplies. Instead, Frank saw division everywhere he looked. Sidelong glances, whispered conversations, clusters of wolves grouped together like separate islands in a fragmenting archipelago. Rosalind stood to his right, her expression carved from stone. Theodore Davidson was posted at the main entrance, ensuring no one left before Frank gave permission. It felt wrong, treating his own pack like suspects, but Kayla Warner's words had left no room for doubt. One of ours. The fire was set by one of our own. I know you're all tired, Frank began, his voice carrying across the hall. I know you're scared. We just lost months' worth of winter supplies, and I won't lie to you, that makes our survival exponentially harder. But right now, I need honesty more than I need comfort. He paused, meeting as many eyes as would hold his gaze. Too many looked away. Someone set that fire deliberately. Kayla saw them running from the scene wearing pack colors, which means someone in this room, someone I've protected, someone I've bled for, someone I would die for, betrayed us all. Frank's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he hated himself for it. Alphas weren't supposed to show weakness. So I'm asking now, before this goes any further, if you know something, if you saw something, speak now. We can't heal if we're hiding poison. Silence greeted his words. Not the comfortable silence of contemplation, but the heavy, oppressive silence of secrets being swallowed. Frank waited. 10 seconds. 20. A full minute of crushing quiet, broken only by the crackle of the central fire and the sound of his own thundering heartbeat. Finally, Bill Stephenson raised his hand. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, mated to Adriana Winters, father of 2. Frank had personally helped deliver his youngest daughter during a complicated birth 2 years ago. Speak, Bill, Frank said, hope flaring in his chest. Bill stood, but he wouldn't meet Frank's eyes. Alpha, I don't know anything about the fire, but I think there's something you should know. Something a lot of us have been talking about. The hope in Frank's chest withered. Go on. It's about the Moonridge negotiation. Bill shifted his weight uncomfortably. Some of us feel like you gave away too much. The river access, offering our medical expertise, agreeing to catch limits. Alpha, we're the weaker pack. We should be fighting for every advantage, not volunteering to teach them how to take more from us. That's not what Frank started. But Bill wasn't finished. And it's not just Moonridge. Last month, You gave the Ashford pack hunting rights to the Western Territory after they helped us with that roof repair. Before that, you offered sanctuary to those 3 rogue wolves, even though we barely had enough food for ourselves. You're always giving, Alpha. Always compromising. Always bending. Bill's voice grew stronger, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Some of us are wondering when you're going to stop bending and start standing firm. The words hit Frank like physical blows. He'd made those decisions carefully, weighing every option, choosing the path that would bring the most stability to his pack. But hearing them listed like failures, like evidence of weakness. Is that what you all think? Frank asked, his voice quieter now, dangerous. That I'm weak? More murmurs. Some wolves nodded. Others looked torn, conflicted between loyalty and doubt. Kevin Newman stood, one of Frank's trusted hunters, a man who'd fought beside him in 2 border skirmishes. Alpha, no one thinks you're weak. We wonder if maybe you care too much about everyone else's well-being and not enough about ours. You're so focused on keeping peace with other packs that you're not seeing what's happening here. We're struggling, Frank. Really struggling. And sometimes it feels like you're more concerned with being liked than being strong. Frank's hands clenched at his sides. Everything I've done, every decision I've made, has been to protect this pack. To keep us alive and thriving without unnecessary bloodshed. Do you think I want to grovel at Edmund Bright's feet? Do you think I enjoy negotiating from a position of weakness? His voice rose, carrying 7 years of exhaustion and frustration. I do what I must to keep you safe. All of you. And if that means swallowing my pride, if that means compromising, if that means being called weak by wolves who've never had to make these impossible choices, then so be it. The hall erupted in voices, some supporting Frank, others arguing against him. Rosalind stepped forward, her hand on his arm in warning. He was losing control of the room. Losing control of everything. Enough. The command cracked through the air like lightning, carrying the full weight of Alpha authority. Every wolf fell silent instantly, their instincts responding even if their hearts had started to stray. Frank took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm. We can debate my leadership later. Right now we have a saboteur to find. Kayla. Describe exactly what you saw. Kayla stood reluctantly, her hands twisting together. It was maybe 10 minutes before the fire was spotted. I was coming back from the river with water for my mother, she's been sick. And I saw someone running from the storage sheds. They were fast, and the smoke was already starting, so I couldn't make out their face. But they were definitely wearing our colors. Brown and gray, the pack pattern. Male or female? Rosalind pressed. I think male, but I'm not certain. They were about average height, maybe a little on the shorter side. Frank's mind raced through the pack roster. Average height, male, fast enough to outrun notice. That description fit at least a dozen wolves. Did anyone else see anything unusual this morning? Frank asked. Anyone near the eastern sheds before the fire? Bet Garza raised her hand tentatively. She was an Omega wolf, quiet and nervous by nature, often overlooked in pack gatherings. I saw Clifton Post heading that direction around dawn. He had a basket with him. All eyes turned to Clifton, the father of the little girl who'd asked Frank to go fishing that morning. Clifton's face went pale. I was gathering firewood, he said quickly. The basket was for kindling. Alpha, you can't think I would never. My family lives here. Let him speak, Frank ordered, though his heart was sinking. He didn't want it to be Clifton. Didn't want it to be anyone, but especially not the father of that gap-toothed child who still looked at him with uncomplicated trust. I gathered wood from the eastern forest and brought it back to our cabin, Clifton continued, his voice shaking. I was nowhere near the storage sheds. Bet must have seen me on the path that runs near the sheds, but I never went close to them. I swear on my daughter's life, Alpha, I didn't do this. Frank studied Clifton's face, searching for deception. All he saw was terror and sincerity. But what did he really know about reading people? Clearly he'd been blind to the discontent festering in his own pack. What else had he missed? Does anyone else have information? Frank asked, hating the pleading note that had crept into his voice. Ernest Doyle, one of the pack's elders, stood slowly. He was nearly 70, his hair silver and his movements careful. Alpha, I think you're asking the wrong questions. What do you mean? You're trying to find out who set the fire. But maybe you should be asking why. Ernest's faded eyes held something that looked like pity. Our winter supplies are gone. That means we're vulnerable. Weak. Some might say that's exactly what certain interested parties might want. The implication hung in the air like smoke. You think another pack did this? Frank said slowly. Someone snuck into our territory and set the fire. Or convinced someone in our pack to do it for them, Ernest replied. It wouldn't be the first time a stronger pack tried to destabilize a weaker one before absorbing it. The Riverwood pack fell apart that way 5 years ago, remember? Internal sabotage, accusations flying everywhere. And by the time they figured out what was happening, they were too fractured to resist the takeover. Murmurs of unease rippled through the crowd. Frank remembered Riverwood, a cautionary tale told around fires as a warning about the dangers of internal discord. Who would benefit from our collapse? Rosalind asked, her tactical mind already working through scenarios. Moonridge, Kevin Newman said immediately. They want our river access. What better way to get it than to engineer our downfall and absorb our territory? Or the Ashford pack, Adriana Winters added. They've been eyeing our northern hunting grounds for years. Or maybe it's just one of us. Dennis Crane spoke up from the back of the hall, his voice cutting through the speculation like a blade. Maybe one of us is tired of scraping by under an alpha who gives away everything we earn. Maybe one of us thinks we'd be better off under stronger leadership. Maybe the call is coming from inside the house, and you're all so desperate to believe in external enemies that you can't see the rot right in front of you. The hall exploded in accusations and denials. Wolves turned on each other, voices rising in anger and fear. Frank watched his pack, his family, tear itself apart before his eyes, and he felt completely powerless to stop it. Silence. They obeyed, but barely. The damage was done. Seeds of suspicion had been planted, and Frank could see them taking root. In every face, every whispered exchange, every sidelong glance. This was exactly what the saboteur wanted. Division, chaos, the pack turning against itself. Everyone is dismissed, Frank said, his voice hollow. Return to your homes. Rosalind, Theodore, and I will investigate further. If anyone remembers anything else, come to me directly. And until we identify the culprit. He paused, hating what he was about to say. Travel in pairs. Trust no one completely. Not even each other. The pack dispersed slowly, reluctantly, breaking into suspicious clusters. Frank watched them go, feeling the bonds that held them together fraying like rope under tension. When the hall was finally empty except for Rosalind and Theodore, Frank sank onto the nearest bench, his head in his hands. This is bad, Theodore said unnecessarily. It's worse than bad, Rosalind corrected. She moved to stand in front of Frank, forcing him to look up at her. Frank, Dennis is right. This kind of division doesn't come from nowhere. Someone's been poisoning the pack against you, probably for months. The fire was just the catalyst, the match that lit a fuse that was already burning. Then we find who did it, Frank said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. We find them, we expose them, and we prove that I haven't been, that I'm not. He couldn't finish the sentence. Wasn't sure what he was trying to prove anymore. What if it's too late? Theodore asked quietly. What if the pack is already too far gone? Frank looked at the young wolf, seeing his own fears reflected back at him. Then he stood, straightening his shoulders, touching the alpha stone at his chest. Then I fight harder, he said. Because that's what alphas do. We don't give up on our people, even when our people give up on us. But even as he spoke the words, Frank wondered, at what point did devotion become delusion? At what point did loyalty become the chain that dragged you down to drown? Chapter 4. The Anonymous Note. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small cabin at the edge of the settlement, the alpha stone clutched in one hand, watching the moon track its slow path across the sky. Every sound made him tense: the crack of a branch, the rustle of wind through leaves, the distant howl of a wolf that might have been a greeting or a warning. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The one who breaks so others don't have to. Well, he was breaking. He could feel it happening, slow and inexorable as ice cracking under weight. And the worst part was that he couldn't tell if breaking was a sign of strength or failure. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his spiral of thoughts. Come in, he called, expecting Rosalind with an update on the investigation. Instead, Tammy Wolf slipped through the door, her healer's bag slung over one shoulder. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and capable hands that had set bones, delivered babies, and closed the eyes of the dying. Frank trusted her more than almost anyone in the pack. She'd been his father's healer and had delivered Frank himself 30 years ago. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, moving to light the lantern on his table. "When's the last time you ate? Or slept?" "I don't remember," Frank admitted. "Tammy, what are you doing here? It's past midnight." She settled into the chair across from him, studying his face with clinical concern. "I'm here because someone needs to tell you the truth, and everyone else is too afraid or too caught up in the drama to do it." She leaned forward. "Your pack is falling apart, Frank. And not because of the fire. The fire was just the excuse they were waiting for." The words should have hurt. But Frank was too exhausted for pain. "Tell me something I don't know." "All right." Tammy's expression softened. "You're not your father, Frank. And that's not a criticism, it's an observation. Your father ruled through strength and fear. You rule through compassion and compromise. Neither approach is wrong, but they require different kinds of loyalty. Your father's wolves followed him because they were afraid not to. Your wolves follow you because they choose to, and the problem with choice is that it can be unchosen." Frank set the alpha stone on the table between them, watching firelight play across its silver veins. "So what do I do? Become more like him? Rule through intimidation?" "God, no." Tammy reached across and squeezed his hand. "The world doesn't need more alphas like your father. But you need to understand that some wolves don't respect kindness. Some wolves see compromise as weakness. And right now, those wolves are the loudest voices in your pack." "Who?" Frank asked. "Who's turning them against me?" Tammy hesitated, conflict clear on her weathered face. "I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions. There are wolves who've been holding secret meetings, small gatherings, never more than 4 or 5 at a time. They're careful not to be obvious about it. But I've noticed patterns. Absences that line up, conversations that stop when the wrong person approaches." Frank's blood ran cold. "How long has this been going on?" "Months. Maybe longer." Tammy pulled her hand back, her expression troubled. "Frank, I think there's a faction forming. Wolves who want different leadership. They're using the fire, the supply shortage, your negotiation with Moonridge, everything as evidence that you're not fit to be alpha." The words landed like stones in Frank's stomach. A faction. Not just one disgruntled wolf, but an organized group working to undermine him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, trying to keep accusation out of his voice. "Because I wasn't sure. Because I didn't want to add to your burden if I was wrong. And because—" She paused, meeting his eyes. "Because I was afraid you'd do exactly what you're doing now, blame yourself. Tear yourself apart trying to figure out what you did wrong. Frank, listen to me. You're a good alpha. Maybe the best alpha this pack could have asked for. But some wolves would rather have a bad alpha who makes them feel strong than a good alpha who makes them feel safe." A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, moving quickly past Frank's cabin. He was at the door in seconds, pulling it open to see a figure disappearing into the darkness between buildings. "Wait," Frank called, but the figure didn't stop. He could have chased them down. Should have. But exhaustion weighted his limbs like lead, and the thought of another confrontation, another accusation, another piece of his heart being torn away, it was too much. Frank closed the door and turned back to Tammy. "You should go. If someone saw you coming here, they might think you're part of whatever they imagine I'm plotting. Let them think what they want." But Tammy stood, gathering her bag. "Get some sleep, Frank. You can't solve this if you collapse from exhaustion." After she left, Frank tried to follow her advice. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of his pack settling in for the night. How many of them were dreaming peacefully? How many were plotting his downfall? Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted. Dawn broke gray and cold, promising rain. Frank forced himself through his morning routine, washing his face in the basin, running a comb through his tangled hair, pulling on clean clothes. He'd just finished lacing his boots when he noticed something had been slipped under his door. A folded piece of paper, the edges rough as if torn from a larger sheet. Frank picked it up with trembling hands, some instinct warning him that whatever was written on this paper would change everything. He unfolded it slowly. The message was written in crude block letters, probably disguised handwriting. If you want to know who set the fire, come to the old mill at noon. Come alone. Tell no one. If you bring anyone, you'll never learn the truth. Frank read it 3 times, his mind racing through possibilities. It was obviously a trap, had to be. No one sent anonymous notes unless they had something to hide or someone to hurt. But what if it wasn't? What if someone genuinely knew who the saboteur was but feared speaking publicly? What if this was his only chance to get real answers? He should tell Rosalind. Should bring Theodore and half a dozen strong wolves to watch his back. Should treat this with the caution it deserved. Instead, Frank found himself pocketing the note and heading to the lodge for breakfast, as if this was just another normal morning, as if his world wasn't crumbling around him. The communal breakfast was subdued. Wolves ate quickly and left, avoiding eye contact, speaking in hushed tones. The easy camaraderie that had once defined pack meals was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. Frank forced down some bread and cheese, though it tasted like ash in his mouth. Rosalind found him halfway through the meal, sliding onto the bench beside him. "Any news?" he asked quietly. "Nothing concrete. I've been asking around, but everyone's too scared to talk. It's like the whole pack has locked down." She paused, studying his face. "You look worse than yesterday. Did you sleep at all?" "A little." The lie came easily, too easily. Frank hated lying to his beta. But if he told her about the note, she'd insist on coming with him, and whoever sent it had been clear. "Come alone, or lose the truth forever." "Frank." Rosalind's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm worried about you. You're taking all of this onto yourself, and it's going to break you. You need to let me help carry the weight." "You already do," Frank said, meaning it. "More than you know." But even as he spoke, he was planning his deception. He'd need to slip away around 11:30, giving himself time to reach the old mill before noon. The mill had been abandoned for years, ever since a flood had destroyed its water wheel. It sat at the edge of their territory, isolated and forgotten, the perfect place for a trap, or a revelation. The morning crawled by in a haze of pretending normalcy. Frank reviewed patrol schedules with Theodore, mediated a minor dispute between 2 families over boundary lines, and checked on 3 wolves who'd been injured fighting the fire. All the while, the note burned in his pocket like a coal. At 11:15, he made his excuses. Told Rosalind he needed to scout the burned storage area, assess what could be salvaged. Told Theodore to organize afternoon patrols without him. Told everyone who asked that he'd be back within 2 hours. Then he shifted into wolf form and ran. The old mill sat beside a dried stream bed, its walls sagging, and its roof partially collapsed. Frank approached cautiously, his wolf senses on high alert for any signs of ambush. He scented the air, nothing but rotting wood, old water damage, and the musty smell of abandonment. He shifted back to human form and entered through the broken doorway. The interior was dim, illuminated only by shafts of weak sunlight filtering through gaps in the roof. Rusted equipment lay scattered across the floor, gears and chains and pieces of machinery whose purpose Frank couldn't identify. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. "Hello?" Frank called, his voice echoing off the walls. "I'm here. Alone, like you asked." Silence answered him. Frank moved deeper into the mill, checking corners and shadows. Nothing. No one. Had this been a cruel joke? A way to get him out of the settlement while something else happened? Then he saw it. Another note, pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. Frank approached it slowly, every instinct screaming danger. The message was brief. "Look down." Frank looked down. At his feet, barely visible under a coating of dust, was a piece of fabric. He knelt and picked it up carefully, brushing away the grime. It was brown and gray pack colors, and it smelled strongly of accelerant. The same accelerant that had been used to start the fire. Frank's hands shook as he held the damning evidence. This was it. Proof that someone in pack colors had set the fire. But who? And why leave the evidence here for him to find? Because they want you to accuse the wrong person. Frank spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Rosalind stood in the doorway, backlit by gray daylight, her expression unreadable. Rosalind, I thought I told you that you were checking the storage area? She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Frank, I've known you for 10 years. I can tell when you're lying. You're terrible at it. She moved closer, her eyes on the fabric in his hands. What is that? Frank showed her, watching her face carefully. Evidence. Someone wanted me to find this. They sent me an anonymous note telling me to come here. Rosalind's expression darkened. And you came alone. Frank, that's exactly the kind of thing that gets alphas killed. This could have been an ambush. I know. But I had to take the chance. And now we have proof. Proof of what? Rosalind interrupted. That someone in pack colors started the fire? We already knew that. This tells us nothing new except that someone wanted to lure you out here alone. Someone who's playing games with you. She was right, and Frank knew it. But holding the physical evidence made it real in a way that speculation hadn't. Someone in his pack had done this. Someone he'd trusted and protected and bled for. We need to analyze this, Frank said, tucking the fabric carefully into his jacket. Find out who it belongs to. Trace the accelerant. Frank. Something in Rosalind's tone made him stop. She was staring at something on the wall behind him. Something Frank had missed in his focus on the evidence at his feet. More words, scratched into the old wood with what looked like a knife. Your bond means nothing to him. The pack watches as their alpha crumbles. And when you fall, we rise. Frank read the words 3 times, each reading driving them deeper into his heart like nails into wood. This isn't just about the fire, Rosalind said quietly. This is personal. Someone hates you enough to want you to suffer before you fall. Frank touched the alpha stone at his chest, seeking its familiar comfort. But for the first time since his father had given it to him, the stone felt cold against his skin, cold and heavy as a millstone hung around a drowning man's neck. Chapter 5, The Council of Wolves. The emergency council meeting was called for that evening, and Frank dreaded it more than any battle he'd ever fought. The council consisted of 7 wolves. Frank as Alpha, Rosalind as Beta, and 5 elected representatives from different pack families. In theory, it was meant to be a democratic check on Alpha authority, a way to ensure that the pack's voice was heard in major decisions. In practice, it had become a formality. Most councils simply approved whatever the Alpha proposed, but tonight would be different. Frank could feel it in the air, thick with tension and unspoken accusations. The council chamber was a small room attached to the main lodge, dominated by a circular table carved from a single massive oak tree. 7 chairs surrounded it, each one bearing the carved symbol of a different pack value: strength, wisdom, loyalty, courage, unity, compassion, and justice. Frank sat in the Alpha's chair, marked with the symbol of unity, and wondered bitterly if that symbol had ever been more ironic. Rosalind took her seat at his right hand. The other 5 council members filed in one by one: Dennis Crane representing the elders, Kevin Newman representing the hunters, Adriana Winters representing the mated families, Abraham Hoffman representing the craftsmen and laborers, and Christian Burke representing the young unmated wolves. Christian was the newest council member, elected just 3 months ago to replace an elder who died of old age. He was barely 28, ambitious and sharp-tongued, and Frank had never quite trusted the calculating look in his eyes. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Frank began, placing the recovered fabric in the center of the table. "I called this meeting because the situation has escalated beyond what I can handle alone. This morning, I received an anonymous note directing me to the old mill. There I found a piece of cloth in pack colors, stained with the same accelerant used to start yesterday's fire." Dennis Crane leaned forward, squinting at the evidence. "So we have confirmation. One of ours is responsible." "It appears that way," Frank acknowledged. "But there's more." He unfolded a sketch he'd made of the carved message on the mill wall. This was scratched into the wood. "Someone isn't just trying to destroy our supplies, they're trying to destroy faith in my leadership." The council members passed the sketch around, their expressions ranging from shock to something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. Christian Burke was the first to speak. "Alpha, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. This message, your bond, means nothing to him. What does that mean? Who is him? And what bond are we talking about? Frank had anticipated this question but still didn't have a good answer. I don't know. It could be referring to Edmund Bright and the Moonridge negotiations. Or it could be intentionally vague, meant to sow confusion. Or, Kevin Newman said carefully, it could be referring to your bond with the pack. The bond that's supposed to be sacred and eternal. As you mentioned in your speech yesterday. He paused, his discomfort evident. Alpha, you know I respect you, but I have to be honest, there are wolves who feel like that bond has become one-sided. That you give everything and ask for loyalty in return, but when we question your decisions, you treat it as betrayal. The accusation stung precisely because there was truth in it. Frank did take questioning personally. Every disagreement felt like a rejection, every doubt like a dagger. I've never punished anyone for voicing concerns, Frank said, keeping his voice level. This council exists precisely so that wolves can challenge my decisions. In theory, Adriana Winters interjected. Her voice was soft but firm. But in practice, Frank, you make us all feel guilty for disagreeing with you. You're so obviously hurt by any criticism that wolves avoid giving it. They'd rather let resentment build than see that wounded look in your eyes. Frank felt like he'd been slapped. I don't mean to. We know you don't mean to, Dennis Crane cut in, his weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy. That's what makes this so damn complicated. You're not a tyrant, Frank. You're not cruel or selfish or power-hungry. You're just a man who's carrying more weight than any person should bear. And you're so determined not to crush anyone with that weight that you're crushing yourself instead. And the pack can see it. They watch you bend and break and bleed, and some of them feel protective, but others, he trailed off. Others see weakness, Christian Burke finished, his voice carrying an edge that made Frank's hackles rise. They see an alpha who can't make hard decisions, who prioritizes everyone's feelings over the pack's survival, who would rather negotiate away our resources than fight for what's ours. Is that what you think? Frank asked, meeting Christian's eyes directly. That I'm weak? Christian didn't flinch. I think you're a good man who might not be suited for this role. I think your father chose you because you were his son, not because you were the best choice to lead. And I think this fire, this sabotage is just the catalyst that's making everyone admit what we've been thinking for years. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank looked around the table, searching for allies. Rosalind's jaw was clenched tight, her hands fisted on the table. Dennis looked uncomfortable but not disagreeing. Kevin and Adriana wouldn't meet his eyes. Abraham Hoffman, who'd been silent until now, stared at the table as if wishing he could disappear through it. So that's it? Frank's voice came out hoarse. Years of service, years of keeping this pack safe and fed and stable, and all it takes is one fire and some anonymous notes for you to decide I'm unfit? It's not just the fire, Adriana said gently. Frank, we've been losing wolves, not to death or exile, but to other packs. In the last 2 years, 6 wolves have requested transfer to other territories. That's nearly 15% of our pack. Wolves don't leave a strong pack. They leave when they don't believe in the future anymore. 6 wolves. Frank had known about each transfer request, had approved them with a heavy heart, but he told himself it was natural movement, individual circumstances. He'd never considered that it might be a pattern, a symptom. Who else knows about this meeting? Frank asked quietly. About what's being said here. Christian and Kevin exchanged a glance that told Frank everything he needed to know. There have been discussions, Kevin admitted, among some of the pack members, about whether it might be time for a change in leadership. A change in leadership. Frank repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. You mean a challenge? Someone wants to challenge me for Alpha. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alpha challenges were brutal affairs, physical combat, that ended when one wolf submitted or died. Frank's father had fought 3 challenges during his reign, winning each one through sheer vicious strength. Frank had never been challenged, had never expected to be. The pack had accepted him when his father died, had given him the Alpha Stone without contest. But acceptance could be withdrawn. Loyalty could be revoked. Who? Frank demanded. Who wants to challenge me? No one's come forward officially, Abraham Hoffman said quickly, speaking for the first time. It's just talk. Speculation. But He hesitated. But if someone did challenge you, Christian finished, there's a good chance the pack would support it. Especially now, with winter coming, and our supplies destroyed. Wolves follow strength, Alpha. And right now, you're not projecting strength, you're projecting desperation. Frank wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, to point out every sacrifice he'd made, every success he'd achieved, but the words dried up in his throat, because he could see the truth in their faces. They'd already decided. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with malice, but in their hearts they'd let him go. The bond he'd thought was sacred had frayed beyond repair. If you believe Frank deserves better than this, like this video. Rosalind finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This is exactly what the saboteur wants. Can't you see? They set the fire, left false trails, sent cryptic messages, all designed to turn us against each other. And you're playing right into their hands. Maybe, Christian said, unmoved. Or maybe the saboteur is just revealing fractures that already existed. Maybe they're forcing us to confront truths we've been avoiding. Or maybe, Rosalind snapped, you're using this crisis as an excuse to push your own agenda. I've seen you, Christian. Whispering in corners, gathering followers, building your own little faction. You want to be alpha, don't you? This is just your way of destabilizing Frank enough to make your challenge seem justified. Christian's eyes flashed dangerously. Careful, Beta. Accusing a council member without evidence is grounds for censure. Is it an accusation if it's true? Rosalind shot back. Enough. Frank's voice cracked like a whip, silencing them both. This council meeting is about finding solutions, not tearing each other apart. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think strategically, despite the emotional turmoil churning in his gut. Here are the facts. Someone sabotaged our winter supplies. That same someone is trying to undermine confidence in my leadership. Whether those actions are related to internal dissatisfaction or external manipulation, the result is the same: our pack is fracturing. So the question isn't whether I'm a good alpha or whether Christian has ambitions. The question is, how do we stop the bleeding before there's nothing left to save? The council members looked at each other, and Frank saw the moment they realized he was right. Whatever their feelings about his leadership, if the pack fell apart, they'd all suffer. We need to identify the saboteur, Dennis said finally. That's priority one. As long as they're operating freely, they can keep driving wedges between us. Agreed, Kevin nodded. But how? They've been careful not to leave evidence that points to anyone specific. We set a trap, Rosalind suggested. Give them another opportunity to strike, but this time we're watching. What kind of trap? Abraham asked. Frank's mind was already racing ahead, forming a plan that made his stomach turn but seemed like the only option. We announce that I'm stepping down temporarily, that I'm so affected by the fire and the accusations that I need time to recover. To reflect on my fitness for leadership. The council stared at him. You can't be serious, Rosalind said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. That's exactly what they want. It makes you look weak. I know, Frank said quietly. But if I step down, even temporarily, it creates a power vacuum. And whoever's behind this, whether it's someone in this room or someone outside it, they'll make their move. They'll have to. And when they do, we'll be ready. That's a huge risk, Dennis warned. Once you step down, even temporarily, it's hard to reclaim authority. The pack will see it as an admission of failure. Maybe it is, Frank said, and the words hurt more than he'd expected. Maybe I have failed. But if my failure is what it takes to expose the rot and save this pack, then I'll accept it. Christian Burke studied Frank with new interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You'd really sacrifice your position? Your pride? I'd sacrifice anything for this pack, Frank said simply. That's what being alpha means. Or at least, that's what it's always meant to me. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Kevin Newman nodded slowly. All right, if you're serious about this, I'll support it. But we need safeguards. A time limit on your absence, clear conditions for your return. 2 weeks, Frank said. I step down for 2 weeks. Rosalind acts as interim alpha. If we haven't identified the saboteur by then. He paused, swallowing hard. Then maybe the pack really does need new leadership. Frank, Rosalind started, but he cut her off. It's decided. We'll make the announcement tomorrow morning. He stood, and the others rose with him out of instinct. This meeting is adjourned. As the council members filed out, Frank remained standing, his hands braced on the table, staring at the piece of evidence that had started all of this. A scrap of fabric that represented the unraveling of everything he'd built. Rosalind waited until they were alone before speaking. "This is a mistake. You're playing right into their hands." "Maybe," Frank acknowledged. "Or maybe I'm finally making the hard choice everyone's been accusing me of avoiding. By giving up? By trusting that the truth will come out." Frank looked at his beta, his oldest friend, and saw the fear in her eyes. "Rosalind, if I'm not the right alpha for this pack, then staying in power is just ego. Just pride. And I won't let my pride destroy wolves I love." "Your pride isn't the problem," Rosalind said fiercely. "Your willingness to believe every accusation, to take every criticism as gospel truth, that's the problem. You're so convinced you're failing that you can't see your successes, and now you're going to step down and prove everyone right who ever doubted you." Frank touched the alpha stone, feeling its weight. "I'm tired, Rosalind. So tired of fighting for wolves who don't want to be fought for. Of bleeding for people who measure my blood and find it insufficient. Maybe it's time to let go. To let someone else carry this weight. And if no one else can?" Rosalind's voice cracked. "If it turns out you were the only one holding this pack together, and without you we fall apart completely?" Frank had no answer for that. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, part of him wanted exactly that. Wanted the pack to fail without him, just to prove he'd mattered. Just to show them what they'd lost. And that shameful, petty part of himself disgusted him more than any accusation the council had thrown at him. "Go home," Frank said quietly. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be hard." Rosalind looked like she wanted to argue further, but finally she nodded and left, her footsteps echoing down the empty hall. Alone in the council chamber, Frank sank back into his chair and allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of his despair. The bond was broken, the pack was fracturing, and he, Frank Pugh, the alpha who would have died for his wolves, was about to walk away. Not because he wanted to, but because staying would mean watching them tear themselves apart, and he loved them too much to let his presence be the catalyst for their destruction. Chapter 6. The Announcement. Dawn came too quickly, and with it, the end of everything Frank had built. He stood before the gathered pack in the main lodge, the alpha stone heavy against his chest, and wondered if this would be the last time he wore it. 43 wolves stared back at him, some with sympathy, some with barely concealed satisfaction, most with simple confusion about why they'd been summoned so early. Rosalind stood at his right side, her posture rigid with disapproval. She'd tried one last time that morning to talk him out of this, but Frank had been resolute. This was the only way forward he could see, the only path that didn't end in civil war. "Thank you all for coming," Frank began, his voice steady despite the chaos raging inside him. "I know this is unusual, calling everyone together like this, but what I have to say can't wait, and everyone needs to hear it at the same time." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Clifton Post with his daughter on his shoulders. Tammy Wolfe standing near the back, her expression unreadable. Christian Burke in the front row, leaning forward with predatory interest. Dennis Crane watching with his ancient knowing eyes. 2 days ago, our winter supplies were destroyed by fire. Yesterday, I found evidence that the fire was set deliberately by someone wearing pack colors. Someone we've trusted, someone we've lived alongside, someone who wants to tear this pack apart. Frank's voice grew harder. But I've come to realize that the fire isn't the real problem. The real problem is that our pack is already broken, fractured by doubt and resentment and mistrust, and I can't lead wolves who don't want to be led. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Frank held up a hand for silence. "I've spent the last 7 years as your alpha, 7 years of negotiations and compromises, of sacrifices and hard choices, of trying to keep us safe and fed and whole. And I thought I truly believed that was enough. That dedication and love and tireless service would be sufficient to earn your loyalty." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong." "Frank, don't," Rosalind started, but he shook his head. "I'm not blind. I see the way some of you look at me now. I hear the whispers. I know there are wolves who think I'm weak, who believe this pack would be better off under different leadership. And maybe you're right. Maybe my father was wrong to choose me. Maybe compassion isn't what an alpha needs. Maybe what you need is someone harder, someone who won't lose sleep over every difficult decision, someone who can lead without letting their heart get in the way. The murmurs grew louder. Wolves looked at each other, confusion mixing with growing alarm. So, I'm stepping down. The lodge erupted. Shouts of disbelief, cries of protest, expressions of satisfaction, all of it crashed over Frank like a wave. He stood motionless in the center of the chaos, watching his pack tear itself apart over his announcement just as they'd been tearing themselves apart over everything else. Silence. Rosalind's command cut through the noise like a blade. Let him finish. The crowd reluctantly quieted, though the tension remained thick enough to choke on. I'm stepping down for 2 weeks, Frank clarified. Rosalind will serve as interim alpha during that time. If, by the end of those 2 weeks, we've identified the saboteur and restored unity to this pack, I'll resume my position. If not, he touched the alpha stone at his chest, then this pack deserves leadership that can give you what I apparently cannot. This is madness. Tammy Wolf pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her healer's composure shattered. Frank, you can't just abandon us because a few malcontents started rumors. That's exactly what they want. I'm not abandoning anyone, Frank said quietly. I'm giving the pack space to decide what it really needs, and I'm removing myself as a variable so we can identify who's really working against us. Christian Burke stood, his expression carefully neutral. Alpha, or should I say, former Alpha, this is very noble of you. But have you considered that stepping down might embolden the saboteur? That it might signal to our enemies that we're weak and divided? Our enemies already know we're divided, Frank replied. The fire made sure of that. At least this way we're being honest about it instead of pretending everything's fine while we rot from the inside. And what if someone challenges Rosalind for the position? Kevin Newman called out from the middle of the crowd. What if this just triggers more instability? Then you'll have to decide, Frank said, meeting Kevin's eyes. You'll have to choose what kind of pack you want to be, what values you want to uphold, whether strength means brutality or whether it means something more. He removed the alpha stone from around his neck. The movement was simple. Practiced his fingers finding the clasp, the leather cord sliding free. But the weight of the moment made it feel like he was removing his own heart and placing it on display. This stone has been passed down through 5 generations of alphas in my family. My father gave it to me on his deathbed, and I've carried it every day since. Frank held it up so everyone could see the silver veins pulsing with their strange inner light. It's supposed to represent the bond between alpha and pack, the sacred, eternal, unbreakable bond that keeps us united. But a bond is only as strong as the wolves who honor it. And if that bond is broken... He placed the stone in Rosalind's hand, closing her fingers around it. Then maybe it's time for someone else to try rebuilding it. Rosalind's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Frank, please, don't do this. Take care of them, Frank said softly, for her ears only. Find the saboteur. Save the pack. Do what I couldn't. He turned back to face the assembled wolves one last time. I'll be staying in my cabin. If anyone has information about the fire, about the sabotage, about anything that might help us heal, come to me. I may not be your alpha anymore, but I'm still part of this pack. I still care about every single one of you, even the ones who wish I'd never been chosen. His voice wavered. Especially those ones, maybe. Because if I'd been better, stronger, more of what you needed, maybe none of this would have happened. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected sound. Applause. Slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the lodge. Frank's eyes found the source, and his blood ran cold. Edmund Bright stood in the doorway, flanked by Claire Jordan and 3 other Moonridge wolves. They must have been so focused on Frank's announcement that no one had noticed them arrive. Bravo, Edmund said, his deep voice carrying across the stunned silence. That was quite a performance, Pew. Very moving, very pathetic. Frank's hands clenched at his sides. What are you doing here, Edmund? This is pack business. Which makes it very much my business. Edmund strode forward, the crowd parting before him like water. You see, when I heard rumors that the Clearwater pack was imploding, I had to see it for myself. And I must say the reality exceeds my expectations." He looked around at the gathered wolves with undisguised contempt. "You had a good alpha. Not a strong one, perhaps, but a good one. And you broke him. Tore him down piece by piece until he believed every lie you whispered about him. Impressive work, really." "Get out," Rosalind snarled, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "You have no right." "Actually, I have every right." Edmund pulled a folded document from his jacket. "This is a treaty, signed 3 years ago by Alpha Pew and myself. It states that in the event of a leadership crisis in either pack, the other has the right to intervene to ensure regional stability. And this?" He gestured at the chaos around them. "This certainly qualifies as a crisis." Frank's stomach dropped. He remembered that treaty, a formality he'd agreed to during a minor border dispute, never imagining it would be invoked like this. "The treaty specifies intervention, not invasion," Frank said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You can offer counsel. You can mediate. You can't just waltz in here and—" "And what?" Edmund interrupted. "Take over?" "Oh, I'm not here to take over, Pew. I'm here to make an offer." He addressed the crowd now, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Clearwater Pack is failing. Your supplies are destroyed. Your alpha has abdicated, and winter is coming. You'll never survive on your own. But Moonridge is strong. We have resources, territory, protection. We're offering you a merger. Join us. Become part of something bigger, something stronger. And in return, you'll have food in your bellies and safety for your pups." "A merger," Rosalind repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "You mean absorption. You mean the complete destruction of Clearwater as an independent pack." "Semantics." Edmund waved a dismissive hand. "The point is survival. And right now that's something Clearwater can't guarantee on its own." Frank watched the faces of his pack, former pack. He corrected himself bitterly as they processed Edmund's offer. He saw calculation in some eyes, hope in others, resistance in a few, but mostly he saw exhaustion. Wolves too tired to fight, too worn down by constant struggle. This was his fault. His weakness had brought them to this point. "No." The word came from an unexpected source. Clifton Post stepped forward, his young daughter still perched on his shoulders, his expression resolute. "No," he repeated, louder this time. "We're not joining Moonridge. We're not abandoning who we are just because things got hard." "Clifton," Edmund started, but Clifton cut him off. "Alpha Frank made mistakes. Maybe a lot of them. Maybe he was too soft, too willing to compromise. But he was our alpha. He bled for us. He went without so we could eat. He negotiated with you, Edmund, to keep us from starving or fighting a war we'd lose. And yes, maybe his methods weren't always perfect, but at least he cared. At least he tried." Clifton's voice cracked. "And we repaid him by tearing him apart from the inside. By letting poison spread through the pack, until he believed he wasn't good enough. Well, I'm done with that. I'm done letting cowards and saboteurs dictate our future." Tammy Wolf moved to stand beside Clifton. "I stand with Clifton. And with Frank. I don't care if he's wearing the Alpha Stone or not, he's my alpha. He earned that loyalty. He doesn't have to keep earning it every single day." One by one, others began to move. Theodore Davidson, Abraham Hoffman, Kayla Warner, nearly a dozen wolves, forming a line between Edmund Bright and the rest of the pack. But Frank noticed who didn't move. Christian Burke remained seated, his expression calculating. Kevin Newman stayed where he was, uncertainty written across his face. Adriana Winters looked torn, her mate Bill pulling her back when she started to step forward. The pack was splitting before his eyes. And it was his announcement, his abdication, that had forced them to choose sides. "How touching," Edmund said, though his smile had faded. "A dozen loyalists willing to go down with a sinking ship. But what about the rest of you?" He addressed the silent majority. "How many of you are willing to starve this winter out of misplaced loyalty to an alpha who just admitted he failed you?" "He didn't fail us," Rosalind said, her voice cutting like ice. "We failed him. And we're going to fix that. But not by selling ourselves to you, Edmund. Clearwater remains independent. Now get out of our lodge before I have you removed." Edmund's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You can't enforce that order, Beta. You don't have the authority yet. Frank abdicated. But you haven't been formally accepted by the pack. Right now, Clearwater doesn't have an alpha at all. Which makes my treaty intervention perfectly legal. He was right, and everyone knew it. There was a gap, a dangerous vacuum between Frank's abdication and Rosalind's installation. A gap that Edmund Bright was exploiting with ruthless efficiency. Then we'll hold an emergency vote, Frank said, surprising himself. Right now. The pack votes on whether to accept Rosalind as interim alpha, or whether to accept Edmund's merger offer. Majority rules. Democratic and binding. Edmund smiled. I accept those terms. Though I suspect you won't like the results, Pew. Frank's heart hammered in his chest as he watched Rosalind pull a piece of chalk from her pocket and draw 2 lines on the floor. Those who accept me as interim alpha and choose to remain independent, stand on my left, Rosalind announced. Those who wish to accept Moonridge's merger offer, stand on my right, choose now. The moment of truth had arrived. The wolves began to move. Chapter 7. The Divide. Frank had faced down hostile packs, negotiated with territorial rivals, and survived his father's brutal training regimen. But nothing in his 30 years had prepared him for the agony of watching his pack literally divide before his eyes. The wolves moved slowly, each one's choice a small betrayal or a small redemption. Some walked with confidence, others shuffled with visible reluctance. A few couldn't decide at all, and stood frozen in the middle, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Clifton Post was first to Rosalind's left, his daughter clutching his neck tightly. Tammy Wolfe joined him immediately. Then Theodore Davidson, his young face set with determination. Abraham Hoffman followed, then Kayla Warner, then others, a trickle that became a small stream. But on Edmund's side, the stream was larger. Christian Burke moved first, his calculated expression never wavering. Kevin Newman followed after a moment's hesitation, unable to meet Frank's eyes. Bill Stephenson pulled his mate Adriana to Edmund's side, despite her visible reluctance. Bet Garza went right. Jeffrey Cole, wait, no, he was already Moonridge, but other Clearwater wolves followed. Iva Johnston, Ernest Doyle. Nearly 24 wolves making the choice that Frank's leadership wasn't worth the risk of starvation. When the movement finally stopped, Frank did the count that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 21 wolves stood with Rosalind. Independence. Faith in their own strength. 22 stood with Edmund. Security. Survival at the cost of identity. A perfect split. Almost exactly down the middle. Well, Edmund said, his smile returning in full force. That's unfortunate. A tie means we'll need a tiebreaker. And since Frank abdicated, he doesn't get a vote. Which means, I get a vote. Every head turned toward the door. Dennis Crane stood in the entrance, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his weathered face grim. Frank hadn't even noticed his absence during the choosing. I was outside, Dennis explained, his voice carrying despite his age, checking something, had to be sure before I made my choice. He looked at Edmund Bright with undisguised contempt. You're clever, Bright. I'll give you that. Clever enough to exploit a crisis, clever enough to twist treaties to your advantage. But you made one mistake. And what's that, old man? Edmund asked, amusement coloring his tone. You came too quickly. Dennis moved into the lodge, each step deliberate. The fire was yesterday. Frank's abdication was decided last night. Yet here you are, first thing this morning with a treaty in hand, and a merger proposal ready to go. Almost like you knew this was coming. Almost like someone told you exactly when to arrive. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. That's a serious accusation, Edmund said, his smile fading. It's a serious situation. Dennis moved to stand beside Rosalind, tipping the balance. 22-22. And I choose independence. Which means Clearwater remains Clearwater. Now get out of our territory, Bright. Your treaty doesn't give you the right to poach wolves who've already voted. Edmund's expression darkened. For a moment, Frank thought the Moonridge Alpha might challenge the vote, might push for violence. But then Edmund's gaze swept across the divided pack, and something like disappointment crossed his features. Keep your dying pack, Edmund said coldly. But when you come crawling to us in the depths of winter, begging for food and shelter, remember this moment. Remember that you chose pride over survival. He turned to the wolves who'd voted for the merger. Any of you who wish to join Moonridge voluntarily are welcome. We don't poach, but we do accept refugees. Christian Burke stepped forward immediately. I accept your offer, Alpha Bright. If Clearwater is determined to destroy itself, I won't go down with it. Christian, no. Theodore started, but Christian cut him off with a dismissive wave. I'm done pretending this pack has a future. Frank was too weak to lead, and you're all too blind to admit it. I'd rather thrive under strong leadership than starve under weak. He looked directly at Frank. No hard feelings, Pew. You're a good man. You're just a terrible alpha. The words landed like stones, each one precise and devastating. Frank wanted to argue, to defend himself, but what was the point? Christian believed what he believed. And maybe he was right. Kevin Newman followed Christian, then Bill Stevenson, dragging a tearful Adriana with him, Ernest Doyle, 3 more. 7 wolves total, walking away from Clearwater to join Moonridge, leaving their pack bonds behind like shed skin. Frank watched them go and felt something inside him finally, irrevocably break. Traitors, Rosalind spat, her hand on the alpha stone now hanging around her neck. All of you. Don't think you can come back when things improve. You've made your choice. As have you, Edmund replied. He gave a mocking bow to Rosalind. Good luck, interim alpha. You're going to need it. His gaze found Frank one last time. And Pew? When this pack falls apart, and it will remember that I offered you a way out. Remember that your pride killed them. The Moonridge wolves departed, taking the 7 defectors with them. The lodge felt cavernous and empty in their wake, despite the wolves who remained. 22. They were down to 22 wolves, barely half their original strength. We need to secure the borders, Rosalind said, her voice mechanical as she slipped into command mode. Theodore, organize patrols. I want eyes on every entrance to our territory. If Edmund decides to push his advantage, he won't, Dennis interrupted. Not immediately. He's too smart for that. He'll wait. Let us struggle. Let desperation do his work for him. Then, when we're at our weakest, he'll come back with another offer. And next time more wolves will accept. Then we make sure there's no next time, Rosalind said firmly. We survive this winter. We prove we can stand on our own. Frank's compromise with Edmund, the shared river access, the hunter training exchange, we still have that. We can still rebuild. If Edmund honors that agreement, Abraham Hoffman pointed out, he might decide a divided pack doesn't deserve compromise. The weight of their situation settled over the remaining wolves like a suffocating blanket, 22 wolves to feed. Winter supplies destroyed, 7 traders gone, an alpha stone that had changed hands in crisis. And somewhere among them, a saboteur who'd started all of this. Frank felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He'd abdicated to save the pack, but instead he'd given their enemies the perfect opportunity to strike. Everything he'd touched turned to ash. I need to speak, Frank said quietly, but in the heavy silence his voice carried. To everyone who stayed. The remaining wolves turned to him, his loyalists, he supposed, though the word felt both too grand and too tragic. I know what you sacrificed by staying, Frank continued. Security, certainty, a guarantee that you'd survive the winter. You chose the harder path, and you chose it because... He paused, his throat tight. Because you believed in something. In our independence. In our identity. Maybe even in me, though I don't deserve that faith. Frank, Tammy started, but he shook his head. I need to say this. I abdicated because I thought I was the problem. I thought if I removed myself from the equation, the pack could heal. But I see now that I was wrong. The problem wasn't me specifically, it was poison that someone deliberately spread. And that someone is still here. He let those words hang, watching faces carefully. Dennis is right about Edmund arriving too quickly. Someone told him about the council meeting. Someone coordinated this whole thing, the fire, the anonymous notes, the timing of Edmund's arrival. Someone wanted Clearwater to fall apart, and they've been working toward that goal for months. Then we find them, Rosalind said, her voice hard as iron. We find them and we make an example that ensures no one ever tries this again. We find them, Frank agreed. But not through intimidation or fear. That's not who we are. We're Clearwater. We lead with... He almost said compassion but caught himself. With wisdom. We investigate properly. We gather evidence. And we prove that even divided, even broken, we're still stronger than those who tried to destroy us. Clifton Post cleared his throat. With respect, Alpha Frank. Just Frank, he interrupted gently. I abdicated. Remember? No, Clifton said firmly. And several other wolves murmured agreement. You removed the stone. But you're still our Alpha. The stone doesn't make you Alpha, we do. And we choose you. The words were like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Frank wanted to grab it, to believe it, to let their faith rebuild what had been shattered. But he looked at Rosalind, at the stone around her neck, and shook his head. Rosalind is your Alpha now. I gave her the stone. She's earned it. Then we have 2 Alphas, Tammy Wolf said pragmatically. Wouldn't be the first pack to share leadership. And right now, with everything we're facing, we need all the strength we can get. Rosalind looked at Frank, and something passed between them, years of friendship, mutual respect, and the shared burden of impossible responsibility. Co-alphas, she said finally. For the next 2 weeks, until we resolve this crisis, Frank handles external relations and investigation. I handle internal security and resource management. We lead together. It wasn't traditional. It might even be seen as weakness by other packs. But looking around at the wolves who'd stayed, Frank could see relief on their faces. They needed this. Needed to believe that leadership could be shared, that strength didn't always mean singular authority. All right, Frank agreed. Co-alphas. But Rosalind has final say on all decisions. I'm here to support, not to undermine. Agreed. Rosalind extended her hand, and Frank shook it, a compact sealed not in blood or ritual, but in simple human understanding. Dennis Crane cleared his throat. Touching as this is, we still have practical problems. Winter supplies. The saboteur. Border security. Where do we start? With the evidence, Frank said. He pulled out the piece of fabric he'd found at the mill. This cloth has accelerant on it. If we can identify whose clothing it came from. Already tried, Theodore interrupted apologetically. I checked while you were in the council meeting. The pattern is standard pack colors. Could belong to anyone. Dead end. Then we look at who benefits, Rosalind suggested. Christian obviously benefited. He's now positioned to join Moonridge with status. Maybe he was the saboteur all along. Maybe, Frank said slowly. But something doesn't fit. Christian is ambitious, but he's not stupid. Setting a fire that destroys our winter supplies hurts him as much as anyone. Unless he knew Edmund's offer was coming, Dennis finished. Unless the whole thing was coordinated between Christian and Moonridge from the beginning. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. Frank could sense he was missing something crucial, some element that would make everything else make sense. We need to search Christian's belongings, Frank said, before he gets too far into Moonridge territory. If he was communicating with Edmund, there might be evidence. I'll go, Theodore volunteered immediately. I'm fast. I can catch up with them before they cross the border. Take Kayla with you, Rosalind ordered. I want witnesses if you find anything. And Theodore, be careful. If Christian really is the saboteur, he's dangerous. As Theodore and Kayla hurried out, Frank felt a small flicker of hope. They were acting like a pack again, working together toward a common goal. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe they could rebuild. But then Dennis pulled him aside, his ancient eyes troubled. Frank, I need to tell you something. Something I saw this morning that made me certain Edmund was involved. What? Dennis's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I was outside checking the perimeter before the vote, and I saw someone meeting with one of Edmund's wolves in the forest, passing something between them. An exchange. Frank's heart hammered. Who was it? Dennis's expression was grim with reluctance. That's the problem, Frank. I couldn't see clearly. But I know it was someone who stayed. Someone who voted for independence even though they're working with Moonridge. The hope that had flickered in Frank's chest died like a candle in the wind. The saboteur hadn't left with Christian. They were still here, hidden among the wolves Frank trusted most. Chapter 8. The Hunter's Trap. The revelation that the saboteur remained hidden among the loyalists turned the lodge into a pressure cooker of paranoia. Frank watched as the 22 wolves who'd chosen to stay began eyeing each other with suspicion. Conversations stopped when the wrong person approached. Small groups formed and dissolved with nervous energy. The unity they'd felt moments ago evaporated like morning dew under harsh sun. "This is exactly what they want," Rosalind said quietly, standing beside Frank at the edge of the room. "To turn us against each other. To make us so paranoid that we destroy ourselves without any external help." "I know," Frank replied, his jaw tight. "But we can't ignore it either." Dennis saw what he saw. Did he? Rosalind's tone was careful. "Frank, Dennis is 70 years old. His eyesight isn't what it used to be. He saw someone meeting with a Moonridge wolf, but in pre-dawn light, through trees, at a distance. How certain can he really be?" Frank had considered that. Had wanted to believe that Dennis was mistaken, that the saboteur had left with Christian and they could finally start healing. But Dennis's certainty had been absolute, and Dennis had never been one to make accusations lightly. "We need to approach this systematically," Frank said, his mind shifting into analytical mode. "Who among the wolves who stayed would have reason to work with Moonridge? Who benefits from our continued instability?" "Everyone benefits from stability," Rosalind countered. "That's why they stayed, unless..." She paused, her expression darkening. "Unless someone is playing a deeper game. Staying to maintain credibility while continuing to sabotage from within. Making themselves look loyal while orchestrating our downfall." The door burst open, cutting off their conversation. Theodore Davidson stumbled in, breathing hard, his clothes torn and blood streaking down his left arm. "Theodore." Frank was at his side in seconds, catching the young wolf as his legs buckled. "What happened? Where's Kayla?" "Ambush," Theodore gasped out. "We caught up to Christian's group just before the border. I confronted him about the sabotage, demanded to search his belongings. He laughed. Frank just laughed and said we couldn't prove anything. Then 3 Moonridge wolves came out of nowhere. They were waiting for us." Frank's blood ran cold. "Where's Kayla?" "She's fine. Faster than me." She circled back while I held them off. Theodore winced as Tammy Wolf hurried over with her healer's bag. "But Frank, there's more. Before the ambush, I managed to get close enough to hear Christian talking with Edmund's beta, Claire Jordan. They were discussing something about Phase 2 and letting them think they've won. Frank, whatever's happening, we've only seen the beginning." The remaining wolves had gathered around, listening with growing alarm. Frank could see fear replacing suspicion on their faces. An external enemy they could fight. But this a coordinated multi-phase plan to destroy them felt insurmountable. "Phase 2 of what?" Rosalind demanded. "I don't know. They stopped talking when they noticed me," Theodore hissed as Tammy cleaned the wound on his arm. "But the way Christian smiled, he knows something we don't. Something that makes him confident. We're finished." Frank's mind raced. The fire had been Phase 1, destroy their supplies, create chaos, divide the pack. But what came next? What could be worse than what they'd already endured? "We need to secure all our remaining resources," Frank said, shifting into command mode despite his abdication. "Tammy. Inventory. Everything. Food. Medicine, tools, anything valuable. Rosalind, double the patrols. If Moonridge is planning another strike, I want advance warning." "And you?" Rosalind asked. "What will you be doing?" Frank looked at Dennis Crane, who'd been silent throughout Theodore's report. "Dennis and I are going to have a conversation. About exactly who he saw this morning and every detail he can remember." They moved to a quiet corner of the lodge, away from the nervous energy of the pack. Dennis settled onto a bench with a heavy sigh, his walking stick propped beside him. "Before you ask," Dennis said, "I've been replaying it in my mind all morning. Trying to remember every detail. It was just before dawn, maybe 30 minutes before the vote. I couldn't sleep, so I was walking the perimeter, something I do most mornings, old habit from my guard days. That's when I saw them." "Them," Frank prompted. "2 figures?" "Yes. One was definitely wearing Moonridge colors. I could see the brown and gold clearly even in low light. The other was one of ours. They were standing by the old oak tree on the eastern boundary, the one with the lightning scar, close together, speaking in whispers. I saw the Moonridge wolf hand. Something to ours looked like a small package, maybe papers." Our wolf tucked it into their jacket quickly. Could you tell if it was male or female? Dennis hesitated. That's where it gets fuzzy. The build suggested male, but not definitively. Average height, maybe 5 to 9 or 5 to 10. They were wearing a dark jacket and had their hood up. Frank mentally ran through the wolves who'd voted to stay. That description fit at least half a dozen of them. What happened next? The Moonridge wolf left, heading back toward the border. Our wolf waited a few minutes, then returned to the settlement from a different angle, probably to make it look like they were just out for an early walk. I tried to follow, but my old bones don't move as fast as they used to. By the time I got close enough to identify them, they'd already blended back into the morning crowd. But you're certain they voted to stay? Absolutely. I watched the vote carefully, checking every face against my memory of that meeting. Whoever met with Moonridge this morning chose to stay with us. Frank leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him. A traitor in their midst. Someone who looked them in the eye and declared loyalty while working to destroy them from within. We need to draw them out, Frank said finally. Set a trap. Give them an opportunity to make contact with Moonridge again. But this time we'll be watching. Dangerous, Dennis warned. If they suspect we're onto them, they might accelerate whatever they're planning. More dangerous to do nothing. Frank stood, his decision made. I'm going to announce that I've received new information about the sabotage. That I'm close to identifying the culprit. Our traitor will need to warn Moonridge, and when they do, we'll catch them. And if they don't take the bait, then we try something else. But Dennis, we're out of time, Theodore said. Phase 2. Whatever Moonridge has planned, it's coming soon. We need to identify our leak before that happens. Frank returned to the main hall where the pack had gathered in anxious clusters. He could feel their fear, their uncertainty, their desperate need for leadership that could give them answers. If Frank's journey moved you, please don't forget to like this video. I have an announcement, Frank said, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. Theodore's mission revealed that there's more to this conspiracy than we initially believed. Christian and Moonridge are planning something they're calling Phase 2. But here's what they don't know. We have information. Evidence. And I'm very close to identifying exactly who's been working with them from inside our pack. He watched faces carefully as he spoke, looking for tells. A flicker of panic. A nervous glance. Anything that might reveal guilt. By tomorrow morning, I'll have enough proof to expose the traitor. And when I do, when the pack sees who's been betraying us, we'll finally be able to move forward united. Frank paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. So, I'm asking everyone to stay vigilant tonight. Stay in groups. Trust your instincts. And if you see anything suspicious, anything at all, report it immediately to either myself or Rosalind. The wolves dispersed slowly, breaking into protective clusters. Frank noticed who grouped with whom. Who seemed nervous, who seemed calm. But everyone looked unsettled, which made identifying genuine guilt nearly impossible. Rosalind pulled him aside. That was a risky move. If the traitor panics, then they'll make a mistake, Frank finished. That's what I'm counting on. Rosalind, assign watchers to the borders, people you trust absolutely. If anyone tries to leave the settlement tonight, I want to know immediately. On it. She paused. Frank, what if we're wrong? What if there is no traitor among those who stayed? What if Dennis misidentified someone? Or the meeting was innocent? Or, then we've wasted a night of sleep on paranoia, Frank said. But if we're right, we might finally get answers. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Frank helped Tammy inventory their remaining supplies. The count was worse than he'd feared. Even with rationing, they had maybe 6 weeks of food. Winter typically lasted 12 to 14 weeks in their territory. They'd need hunting to supplement, but with reduced numbers and hostile neighbors potentially interfering with their hunting grounds, survival would be a daily struggle. As evening fell, Frank retreated to his cabin, but didn't prepare for sleep. Instead, he positioned himself at his window with a clear view of the settlement's eastern edge. Rosalind had placed watchers on all the obvious exit routes, but Frank had studied the territory for years. He knew the secret paths, the hidden trails. If the traitor was smart, and they'd proven they were, they'd avoid the obvious routes. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting silver light across the settlement. Frank's eyes grew heavy. his exhaustion finally catching up with him. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe the traitor would wait, would be patient, would. Movement. A shadow detaching itself from a cabin on the settlement's edge. Moving carefully, deliberately, using the darkest paths between buildings. Frank's fatigue vanished instantly as he tracked the figure's progress. They were heading east, toward the border, toward Moonridge territory. Frank slipped out of his cabin silently, shifting into wolf form. His gray fur blended with the night shadows as he followed at a distance, careful to stay downwind. The figure moved with practiced ease, clearly familiar with navigating the territory in darkness. They reached the lightning-scarred oak tree Dennis had mentioned. The figure stopped, pulled back their hood, and Frank's heart nearly stopped. It was Tammy Wolf, the pack's healer, the woman who'd delivered Frank himself. Someone he'd trusted absolutely, completely, without question. She stood at the tree, looking around nervously, clearly waiting for someone. Frank wanted to be wrong. Wanted there to be some innocent explanation. Maybe she was gathering night-blooming herbs. Maybe she had insomnia and was taking a walk. Maybe. Another figure emerged from the Moonridge side of the border. Claire Jordan, Edmund's beta. "You're late," Claire said, her voice carrying in the still night air. "I was starting to think you'd gotten cold feet." "I was being careful," Tammy replied. "Frank made an announcement today. He claims to know who the traitor is." "Does he?" "I don't think so. He's fishing. But I can't risk another meeting after tonight." "If he's watching." "He's not," Claire interrupted. "He's too busy playing hero, trying to hold together a pack that's already dead." "Speaking of which, how's the package working?" Tammy pulled something from her jacket, a small vial. "Perfectly. I've been adding it to the communal food in tiny doses. Nothing dramatic enough to notice immediately, but enough to weaken them over time. Another week and they'll be too sick to resist when Edmund makes his move." Poison. The healer had been poisoning their food. Frank's rage was so sudden, so complete, that he barely controlled the urge to charge forward and tear out Tammy's throat. Only years of discipline kept him frozen, kept him listening, kept him gathering evidence. "Good," Claire was saying. "And Frank? Trusts me completely." Tammy's voice was bitter. "Stupid, really. His father was the same way, too willing to believe the best in people. It made them both easy to manipulate." "His father," Claire repeated thoughtfully. "You were there when he died, weren't you?" "I was his healer. Of course I was there. And the illness that killed him, it came on suddenly, rapidly, aggressively." Silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. "Are you asking me something, Claire?" Tammy's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm observing that your loyalty to Moonridge apparently goes back further than we realized. Edmund will be pleased. He's been planning this takeover for years, and having someone inside from the very beginning." Claire smiled. "Well, that's invaluable." Frank's world tilted on its axis. His father's death hadn't been natural. Tammy kind, capable. Tammy, who'd held Frank's hand at his father's deathbed, had murdered him. The woman who'd delivered him into this world had killed the man who'd given him life. "The payment," Tammy said, and Claire handed her a small pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "When this is over, Edmund better honor his promise. I want status in Moonridge. High status. After years of playing nursemaid to weaklings, I've earned it." "You'll get what you deserve," Claire said. And something in her tone suggested it wasn't quite the compliment Tammy took it as. "Now go. And Tammy, if Frank really is close to identifying you, handle it. We can't have him exposing you before Phase 2 is complete." "I'll handle it," Tammy said coldly. "I've handled his family before." They parted, Claire disappearing back into Moonridge territory, while Tammy turned back toward the settlement. Frank remained frozen, his wolf form trembling with suppressed rage and grief. He'd found his traitor. But the cost of that knowledge was the destruction of every assumption he'd held about loyalty, trust, and the people who claimed to love him. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Frank followed Tammy Wolf back to the settlement, his mind a hurricane of rage, grief, and cold calculation. Every instinct screamed at him to shift, to confront her, to make her answer for what she'd done. But years of leadership training held him back. Emotion made you stupid. Anger made you reckless. And right now, Frank needed to be smarter than he'd ever been in his life. Tammy returned to her cabin, the healer's lodge on the settlement's western edge, positioned there so injured wolves could reach her quickly. How many times had Frank come to this door seeking her wisdom, her comfort, her care? How many nights had he sat at her table, sharing his fears and doubts, while she smiled and poisoned his father's memory along with his pack's food? Frank waited until she was inside, then circled back to Rosalind's quarters. He shifted to human form and knocked 3 quick raps, their emergency signal. Rosalind opened the door instantly, a knife in her hand. "Frank? What?" She stopped, seeing his expression. "You found them. Get dressed, quietly. Then meet me at the main lodge in 5 minutes. Bring Theodore and Dennis. No one else." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "And Rosalind? Don't eat or drink anything. Not from the communal stores. Not until I explain." Understanding dawned in her eyes, shock, then horror, then fury that matched his own. "The food?" 5 minutes. Frank was already moving, slipping through shadows toward the main lodge. When the 4 of them assembled in the darkened hall, Frank told them everything. The meeting at the oak tree, the poison in the food, Claire Jordan's implication about his father's death. Every damning word he'd overheard. "Tammy," Dennis breathed. And for the first time since Frank had known him, the old wolf looked genuinely shaken. "All these years. She was there when your father died, Frank. She was the one who told us it was lung fever, that there was nothing to be done. We trusted her diagnosis because she was the healer. Because healers don't." He couldn't finish. "Healers don't kill," Theodore finished bitterly. "Except when they're paid to." Rosalind's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. How long has she been poisoning the food?" "She said another week, and we'd be too sick to resist Edmund's takeover," Frank replied. "Which means she's been doing it for a while already, small doses." "Nothing obvious." He paused, memory clicking into place. "The weakness, the exhaustion so many wolves have been complaining about. We thought it was stress from the crisis, but it was her," Rosalind finished. "Systematically weakening the pack, and we're the healers, so we came to her for medicine, which she probably used to make it worse." Her voice shook with barely controlled rage. "I'm going to kill her, Frank. You're going to let me handle this." Frank interrupted, his voice hard as iron. "All of you. Because if we move wrong, if we give her any warning, she'll destroy evidence, she'll claim innocence, and we'll have a trial that tears the pack apart worse than it already is. We need to be smart about this." "What are you proposing?" Dennis asked. Frank had been forming the plan ever since he'd left the oak tree. "We confront her, but we do it right. We gather the entire pack. We present the evidence publicly. And we give her the chance to confess in front of everyone. It's not about revenge, it's about truth. About showing the pack that the rot was real, that our suspicions were justified, and that we've cut it out." "And if she doesn't confess?" Theodore asked. "Then we exile her anyway," Frank said flatly. "With or without confession, she's done. But I want the pack to see her unmasked. To understand that their suffering wasn't random, wasn't bad luck, wasn't my failure as a leader. It was deliberate sabotage by someone they all trusted." Rosalind studied his face in the dim light. "This isn't just about Tammy, is it? This is about you. About proving to the pack that you weren't weak or incompetent, that you were fighting an enemy none of us could see." "Maybe," Frank admitted. "But is that so wrong? Rosalind, 7 wolves left us today. They abandoned the pack because they'd lost faith in my leadership. If I can show everyone that the instability was manufactured, that I was fighting against poison from within, maybe." He trailed off, unable to finish. "Maybe they'll come back," Dennis said quietly. "Maybe Christian will realize he was manipulated. Maybe the pack can heal. Or maybe it's too late," Frank said. "Maybe the damage is done and nothing I do will fix it. But I have to try. I owe them that much. I owe my father that much." The 4 of them spent the next hour planning. They needed to secure the contaminated food, prevent anyone from eating it before the confrontation. They needed to gather the pack without alerting Tammy. They needed to present the evidence in a way that was undeniable. As dawn approached, Rosalind moved through the settlement quietly, waking wolves one by one with whispered instructions. Come to the lodge immediately. Tell no one. Bring nothing. The urgency in her voice ensured compliance without explanation. Frank watched from the shadows as his pack assembled, confused and frightened. 22 wolves, down from 43 just days ago. They looked exhausted, fragile, like a strong wind might blow them apart. And, according to Tammy's confession, many of them were literally poisoned, weakened by doses carefully calibrated to destroy without being detected. When everyone was present except Tammy, Frank nodded to Theodore. The young wolf slipped out, heading to the healer's lodge with a fabricated emergency, a hunting injury that needed immediate attention. Tammy arrived 5 minutes later, her healer's bag over her shoulder, concern etched on her weathered face. The perfect picture of dedication and care. Theodore said someone was badly hurt, she said, scanning the assembled wolves. Where's the patient? There is no patient, Frank said, stepping forward into the light. At least, not in the way you think. Tammy's expression didn't change, but Frank saw it, a microscopic flicker in her eyes, the tiniest tension in her shoulders. She knew. Somehow, she knew she'd been caught. Frank, I don't understand. If there's no emergency, why wake the entire pack at dawn? Because we have a traitor to expose, Frank interrupted. Someone who's been working with Moonridge for years. Someone who set the fire, who's been poisoning our food. Who orchestrated this entire crisis from the inside. He paused. Someone who murdered my father. The lodge erupted in shocked voices. Wolves looked at each other with renewed suspicion. The paranoia Frank had tried to contain bursting forth like water through a cracked dam. That's a serious accusation, Tammy said, her voice steady. Do you have proof? Or is this more of your desperate flailing? More poor leadership trying to deflect blame? The words were calculated to wound. And they succeeded. But Frank had expected them. I have proof, he said quietly. I followed you last night, Tammy. To the lightning-scarred oak. I watched you meet with Claire Jordan. I heard every word. Tammy's face went absolutely still. You're lying. Am I? Frank pulled the vial from his pocket. He'd retrieved it from where Tammy had hidden it after returning to the settlement, while she'd slept. This is what you showed Claire. The poison you've been adding to our food. Small doses, carefully measured. Enough to weaken us without killing us outright. Because Edmund doesn't want corpses, he wants wolves too sick to resist when he makes his final move. The assembled pack stared at the vial, then at Tammy, disbelief warring with growing horror on their faces. That proves nothing, Tammy said. But her voice had lost some of its steadiness. You could have gotten that anywhere. You could have. I heard you confess to Claire Jordan, Frank said, his voice rising. I heard you admit to poisoning the food. I heard you take payment for years of service to Moonridge. And I heard Claire ask about my father's death. About how the illness came on suddenly, rapidly, aggressively. He took a step toward her. You killed him, didn't you? You poisoned him just like you've been poisoning us. Your own Alpha, the man who trusted you to save him. No, Tammy said, but it came out weak. Unconvincing. Yes, Frank roared, and the Alpha command in his voice made every wolf in the lodge flinch. You murdered him. You murdered my father, and then you held my hand at his deathbed and told me there was nothing you could do. You looked me in the eyes and lied while his body was still warm. Tammy's composure finally cracked. He was weak, she shouted back. Just like you. Your father was soft, obsessed with peace and compromise, and making friends with our enemies. He was bleeding the pack dry with his generosity, giving away our resources, our strength, everything that made us powerful. Someone had to stop him. The confession hung in the air like smoke. So you poisoned him, Frank said, his voice dropping back to dangerous quiet. You killed your Alpha because you disagreed with his policies. I saved the pack, Tammy insisted, and Frank could see her shifting strategies, trying to justify, trying to make them understand. Edmund promised that if I helped him, he'd make sure Clearwater wolves were treated well in the merger, that we'd have status and security. Your father would have gotten us all killed with his weakness. I did what had to be done. You betrayed us. Clifton Post spoke up, his voice shaking with rage. You poisoned our food. Our children ate that food, Tammy. My daughter. His voice broke. Small doses, Tammy said quickly. Carefully measured. No one was in real danger, I made sure of that. I'm a healer, I know what I'm doing. This was about weakening resistance, not causing harm. You set our storage on fire, Rosalind said, her hand on the Alpha Stone. You destroyed our winter supplies and blamed it on internal discord. That could have killed us. That wasn't, Tammy stopped herself, but too late. Wasn't you? Frank finished. Then who? Who else is working with you? Tammy's eyes darted around the lodge, looking for escape, for allies, for anything. Finding nothing but hostile faces and growing rage. It doesn't matter, she said finally. Even if you exile me, even if you stop the poisoning, you can't stop what's coming. Clearwater is finished. And when you're begging for mercy at Edmund's feet, remember that I offered you the merciful end. I tried to make it painless. What's phase 2? Frank demanded. What's Edmund planning? Tammy smiled, a cold, bitter expression that held no warmth. You'll find out tomorrow. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Frank wanted to press her, to force answers, but he could see the futility in her eyes. She'd already accepted her fate. Whatever information she had, she'd take it with her out of spite. Tammy Wolf, Rosalind said formally, her voice carrying the weight of alpha authority. You are hereby exiled from Clearwater Pack. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave our territory. If you're found within our borders after that, you'll be killed on sight. Your bonds to this pack are severed. Your name will be struck from our records. You are Omega, packless and alone. The sentence was harsh but traditional. Exile was the ultimate punishment for betrayal, worse than death in many ways. A wolf without a pack was vulnerable, isolated, prey for any hostile force. Tammy's face went pale, but she nodded. Fine. I accept exile. But mark my words, Frank Pugh, when Clearwater falls, when your wolves are scattered and broken, remember that you brought this on yourselves. Weakness has consequences. And you've been weak from the day you were born. She turned and walked out of the lodge, her back straight with defiant pride. Frank watched her go and felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just a vast, aching emptiness where trust used to live. What do we do now? Abraham Hoffman asked quietly. She said phase 2 happens tomorrow. We don't know what that means. Then we prepare for everything, Frank said. He turned to face his pack, reduced, poisoned, battered, but still standing. We secure the borders. We inventory our weapons. We send scouts to watch Moonridge movements. And we survive whatever comes next. Because that's what we do. That's what Clearwater has always done. Together, Rosalind added, standing beside him. Together, the pack echoed, and for the first time in days, Frank heard unity in their voices. But as the wolves dispersed to prepare for the unknown threat, Frank couldn't shake Tammy's final words. Phase 2 happens tomorrow, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Whatever Edmund Bright had planned, it was coming, and Frank had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save a pack that was already hanging by a thread. Chapter 10. The Bond Reforged. The attack came at noon, precisely when the sun stood highest and shadows were shortest, when visibility was perfect and there was nowhere to hide. Frank had expected night, had positioned most of their defenses for a dawn or dusk assault, when wolves fought best and darkness provided cover. But Edmund Bright hadn't become the most powerful alpha in 3 territories by being predictable. The warning howl came from the eastern border, Theodore's voice, urgent and terrified. Frank was running before the echo faded, shifting mid-stride into his wolf form. Around him, the remaining Clearwater wolves did the same, 22 bodies flowing toward the threat with desperate speed. What they found at the border stopped Frank's heart. Edmund Bright stood at the head of 40 wolves, his entire pack, armed and ready for war. But that wasn't what froze Frank in his tracks. It was who stood beside Edmund. Christian Burke, Kevin Newman, Bill Stevenson, Adriana Winters. All 7 wolves who'd defected yesterday, plus another dozen Frank, didn't recognize wolves from other territories. Mercenaries probably, drawn by Edmund's promise of easy pickings. Nearly 60 wolves total, facing down Frank's 22 exhausted, half-poisoned loyalists. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Frank Pugh, Edmund called out, his voice carrying across the clearing that separated the 2 forces. I'm here under the treaty provision for territorial intervention. Your pack is clearly unable to sustain itself. You've lost half your numbers, your winter supplies are destroyed, and your own healer was a traitor. This is your last chance to surrender peacefully and accept merger into Moonridge. Resist, and we'll take your territory by force. You have 5 minutes to decide. Frank shifted to human form, standing naked in the cold air as was tradition during formal challenges. Rosalind shifted beside him, the alpha stone gleaming against her chest. This isn't intervention, Frank called back. This is invasion. Orchestrated invasion. You've been planning this for years, using Tammy to poison us, setting fires, spreading dissent. That's not honor, Edmund. That's cowardice. It's strategy, Edmund replied, unmoved. And it's effective. Look at your wolves, Frank. They're starving, exhausted, poisoned. You can barely stand, and you want to fight? This isn't bravery, it's suicide. He was right. Frank could feel it in his own body, the weakness Tammy's poison had introduced. The exhaustion from days without proper sleep, the toll of constant stress. His wolves looked worse. Some could barely hold their shifted forms. They would lose this fight, badly. Then we lose, Frank said, and heard gasps from his own pack. But we lose as Clearwater, as free wolves who chose to stand rather than kneel. History will remember that we chose dignity over survival. History is written by survivors, Edmund said, and there won't be anyone left to remember your dignity. Final chance, Frank. Surrender now, and I'll absorb your wolves with full status. They'll be fed, protected, given purpose. Refuse, and I'll kill every wolf who resists, including you. Frank looked at his pack. At Clifton Post, who'd stood by him even when others fled. At Tammy Wolf, no, not Tammy anymore. At Dennis Crane, ancient and unbreakable. At Rosalind, who'd carried the Alpha Stone for barely 2 days and was ready to die wearing it. They deserved better than this, deserved a leader who could save them, who could find the clever solution, who could— I challenge you. Every head turned to Christian Burke. He stepped forward from Edmund's ranks, his expression cold and determined. What? Edmund's surprise was evident. Pack law, Christian said loudly, addressing both groups. Any wolf can challenge for alpha position in a pack that's in crisis. Clearwater is definitely in crisis. Frank abdicated, which means the position is open. I challenge for the right to lead Clearwater pack. Frank's mind raced. This was the play, the real phase 2. Not just invasion, but installing a puppet alpha. Someone Edmund controlled who could legitimize the takeover. Frank's not alpha, Rosalind said quickly. I am. If you want to challenge, you challenge me. Christian smiled. But you're interim alpha. Appointed, not chosen. Pack law requires a challenge against the last legitimate alpha, which is Frank. Unless he's too weak to accept. The trap was perfect. If Frank refused, he looked like a coward, and Christian became alpha by default. If he accepted, he'd have to fight in his weakened, poisoned state against a fresh, well-fed opponent who'd spent the last day resting in Moonridge territory. Either way, Christian won, Edmund won, Clearwater fell. I accept your challenge, Frank said, and ignored Rosalind's cry of protest. Traditional rules. Fight until submission, or death. Frank, no. Rosalind grabbed his arm. You're in no condition. Let me fight him. I'm stronger right now, I can. He challenged me specifically because I'm weak, Frank said quietly. Because I'm the symbol of everything they think is wrong with this pack. If I refuse, if I hide behind you, they win anyway. At least this way, the pack sees me fight for them one last time. You'll die, Rosalind said, and tears streaked down her face. Frank, please. There has to be another way. Frank pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. If I die, you lead, you survive, you keep them together. Promise me. I promise, she whispered. But you're not dying. You're going to fight like your life depends on it, because it does. Because all our lives depend on it. Frank stepped into the challenge circle, a space that formed naturally, as wolves from both sides backed away to create an arena. Christian entered from the opposite side, already shifting to his wolf form. He was younger than Frank by 5 years, faster, and hadn't been systematically poisoned for weeks. Frank shifted, feeling his bones crack and reform, feeling the weakness in his limbs that the poison had left behind. His gray wolf was still large, still powerful, but he could feel the difference. The sluggishness. The places where his strength had been leached away. The fight began without ceremony. Christian lunged immediately, going for Frank's throat in a move designed to end things quickly. Frank dodged, barely, feeling teeth scrape across his shoulder instead. Pain bloomed. But Frank used it. Let it sharpen his focus. They circled each other, Christian looking for openings while Frank tried to conserve energy. Every movement cost him more than it should. Every dodge came a fraction slower than his mind commanded. Christian struck again. And this time Frank couldn't fully avoid it. Jaws closed on his front leg, crushing down with enough force to crack bone. Frank howled and twisted, using his weight to throw Christian off balance. They tumbled together, teeth and claws in desperate violence. Frank got his jaws around Christian's ear and tore. Christian screamed a disturbingly human sound from a wolf throat and pulled back, blood streaming down the side of his head. But Frank's leg wouldn't hold his weight properly. The bone wasn't broken, but it was damaged. He limped, trying to keep his weight distributed, knowing that Christian could see the weakness. "You're finished, old man," Christian growled, his words distorted by his wolf form but still understandable. "Just submit. Make it easy on yourself." Frank's response was to lunge forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his leg. He caught Christian's shoulder, drove him backward, used teeth and weight, and 7 years of protective rage. They crashed into the ground, and Frank felt something give in Christian's ribs. But the effort cost him. His damaged leg buckled, and Christian twisted free, coming up behind Frank and latching onto his hindquarters. Fangs sank deep, finding muscle and tendon. Frank tried to turn, to defend himself, but his body wouldn't respond fast enough. Christian was on top of him now, forcing him down, jaws closing around the back of Frank's neck in the killing position. This was it. This was how it ended. On his belly in the dirt, defeated by ambition and poison, and his own exhausted body giving out. Frank closed his eyes, waiting for Christian to finish it. Instead, he heard Christian scream. The weight vanished from Frank's back. He rolled over, gasping, to see Rosalind in her wolf form, her jaws locked around Christian's throat. She'd broken protocol, had entered the challenge circle, and technically that meant Frank had forfeited. But she didn't care. She was willing to sacrifice honor to save Frank's life. "Stop." The command came from an unexpected source. Edmund Bright stood at the edge of the circle, his hand raised, his expression unreadable. "This challenge is invalidated," Edmund announced. "Outside interference means neither party can claim victory, however." He paused, his gaze sweeping across both packs. "I've seen enough. Clearwater pack has heart. More heart than I gave them credit for. Rosalind Travis just forfeited her alpha position and her honor to save a packmate. Frank Pugh was willing to fight to the death in a battle he knew he'd lose. That's not weakness. That's something else entirely." Frank struggled to his feet, his wounded leg barely supporting him. Rosalind released Christian and moved to Frank's side, ready to defend him even though the challenge was over. "I came here to absorb a dying pack," Edmund continued. "To bring stability to a territory that couldn't sustain itself. But I'm realizing that I was wrong. Not about your struggles, those are real. Not about your reduced numbers, those are undeniable. But about what makes a pack worth preserving." He looked directly at Frank. "Your father and I were rivals. I thought he was weak because he chose peace over dominance. I thought you were weaker still, because you followed his path. But watching you now, watching your wolves stand beside you even when survival means surrender, I understand something I didn't before." "What's that?" Frank managed, blood dripping from multiple wounds. "That strength isn't just about winning battles. It's about what you're willing to lose for the bonds you've built." Edmund turned to his pack. "Moonridge wolves, we're withdrawing. This territory belongs to Clearwater, and it will remain so." "What?" Christian struggled to his feet, his wounds already healing with the accelerated rate of shifter metabolism. "Edmund. The plan was predicated on Clearwater being weak and divided," Edmund interrupted. "They're wounded and reduced, yes, but they're not divided. And that makes them stronger than we anticipated. Attacking them now wouldn't be a conquest, it would be murder, and I won't stain Moonridge's honor with unnecessary bloodshed." He met Frank's eyes, and something passed between them, not friendship, but perhaps the beginning of respect. However, Edmund added, I meant what I said about the treaty and the compromise, shared river access, hunter training exchange, medical expertise. Those offers stand. Because helping Clearwater survive benefits the entire region. A stable neighbor is better than occupied territory. Frank wanted to argue, wanted to refuse out of pride and anger at everything Edmund had orchestrated. But he looked at his pack, wounded, exhausted, barely standing, and made the choice his father would have made. We accept, Frank said. With conditions. Tammy Wolf is exiled from both our territories. Any wolf who aided in her sabotage faces the same fate. And Christian Burke, Frank looked at the younger wolf, you made your choice. You betrayed your pack for ambition. You're Omega now. Neither Clearwater nor Moonridge will shelter you. Christian's face went pale. Edmund, you promised. I promised you status if the plan succeeded, Edmund said coldly. It didn't. Frank's right. You're Omega. Leave both our territories by nightfall or face execution. Christian looked around desperately, finding no sympathy in any face. Finally, he turned and ran, a lone wolf, fleeing into the wilderness, packless and alone. As Edmund and his forces withdrew, the tension in the clearing finally broke. Clearwater wolves collapsed where they stood, adrenaline fading and leaving only exhaustion. Frank shifted back to human form, his legs screaming in protest. Rosalind shifted beside him, pulled off her shirt and tore it into strips to bind his wounds. You idiot, she said, but her voice was thick with emotion. You almost died. You almost... But I didn't, Frank said. We didn't. Rosalind. We survived. Against everything. Against all odds, we survived. Dennis Crane limped over, his ancient face creased with something that looked like pride. You know what you did today, Frank? You led. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But honestly, you showed these wolves that their alpha would die for them. And more importantly, you showed them that sometimes the brave choice and the smart choice aren't the same thing. Sometimes you choose brave anyway. We're still not out of danger, Frank said practically. We've lost 13 wolves total. We have minimal supplies. Winter is coming. Even with Edmund's compromise, survival will be. We'll make it, Clifton Post interrupted, joining them. Because we're Clearwater. Because we don't give up. And because our alpha proved today that bonds matter more than victory. Others gathered around, all 22 wolves who'd chosen to stay, who'd stood against overwhelming odds, who'd refused to surrender their identity. Frank looked at them through eyes that burned with exhaustion and unshed tears. These wolves had every reason to abandon him. He'd been weak. He'd been manipulated. He'd abdicated. He'd nearly gotten them all killed. But they'd stayed anyway. I don't deserve you, Frank said quietly. Any of you. But I swear on the Alpha Stone, on my father's memory, on everything I am, I will earn the loyalty you've shown me. Every day. For as long as I live. Rosalind pressed the Alpha Stone into his hand. The stone she'd worn for barely 2 days. The stone his father had given him 7 years ago. Then start earning it, she said. Lead us, Frank. Not as the Alpha you think you should be, but as the Alpha you are. Flawed. Compassionate. Too willing to bleed for wolves who don't always appreciate it. That's not weakness. That's what makes you worth following. Frank closed his fingers around the stone, feeling its familiar weight settle against his palm. The bond between Alpha and Pack, sacred, eternal, unbreakable. Tammy had tried to destroy it. Edmund had tried to exploit it. Christian had tried to steal it, but it had survived, battered and scarred, but intact. Because some bonds were stronger than betrayal, deeper than fear, more enduring than failure. Frank fastened the Alpha Stone around his neck and stood before his pack. Not as the leader he wished he could be, but as the leader he was, imperfect, exhausted, wounded, but still standing. Clearwater Pack, he said, his voice carrying despite his injuries. We've lost much these past days. Wolves we loved, supplies we needed, illusions we treasured. But we've gained something too. We've gained truth, we've gained clarity, and we've gained the certainty that what binds us together is stronger than anything that tries to tear us apart. He paused, looking at each face, each wolf who'd chosen him over comfort, Pride over security, loyalty over survival. The bond between us means everything. Frank continued. Everything. And I promise you on my life, on my honor, on the memory of every alpha who came before me, I will never take that bond for granted again. We'll rebuild. We'll heal. We'll survive. Together. Together, the pack echoed, and the word rang like a promise through the clearing. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Clearwater Pack turned for home. They limped, they bled, they carried each other when strength failed, but they moved as one, unified by trials that should have destroyed them, bound by choices that defined who they truly were. Frank walked among them, the alpha stone warm against his chest, and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone clinging to illusions, but the solid, earned hope of someone who'd faced the worst and survived, who'd been broken and chose to rebuild, who'd lost everything except the one thing that truly mattered, the bonds that made them family. The pack watched as their alpha walked among them, and this time, they saw not his weakness, but his strength, not his failures, but his refusal to surrender, not the leader he couldn't be, but the leader he was, imperfect, honest, and absolutely unshakably devoted to the wolves who'd chosen to follow him. Your bond means nothing to me, Tammy had said, but she'd been wrong, because in the end, the bond was everything, and Frank Pugh would spend the rest of his life proving it. Epilogue. 6 months later. Winter had come and gone, harsher than anyone had predicted. But Clearwater Pack had survived, lean and scarred, but intact. Edmund Bright had honored every promise. The shared river access had kept them fed. The hunter training had made them more efficient. And surprisingly, a genuine friendship had begun to form between the two alphas, built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. 3 wolves had returned. Adriana Winters, who'd regretted her choice the moment she'd made it. Kevin Newman, who'd realized that security without honor was imprisonment. And Bill Stevenson, who'd followed his mate back home. Christian Burke had been found dead in neutral territory 3 months after his exile, killed by rogues. According to the evidence, Frank had felt nothing when he heard the news. Not satisfaction, not grief, just a distant acknowledgement that actions had consequences. Tammy Wolfe had disappeared entirely, her fate unknown and unlamented. And Frank Pugh stood on Clearwater Ridge once more, looking down at his pack, 25 wolves now, with 2 pregnant females promising new life come spring. The alpha stone hung around his neck, but it felt different now. Not like a burden, but like a reminder of what had been lost, of what had been saved, of what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. Still brooding? Rosalind joined him at the ridge's edge. Reflecting, Frank corrected. There's a difference, is there? But she was smiling. They stood in comfortable silence, watching smoke rise from the rebuilt settlement below, new storage sheds, expanded lodges, a community that had nearly died but chose to live. Do you ever wonder, Frank said quietly, if they were right? Christian, Kevin, the others who left. Maybe I am too soft, too willing to compromise. Maybe a stronger alpha would have. Stop, Rosalind interrupted firmly. Frank, you saved this pack. Not by being the strongest or the most ruthless, but by being you. Stubborn, self-doubting, bleeding heart you. That's what we needed, that's what we still need. Frank touched the alpha stone, feeling its pulse synchronize with his heartbeat. The bond, he said. It really does mean everything. Everything. Rosalind agreed. And together, they turned for home. All right, we've reached the end. But before you go, 2 questions have been eating at me. First, would you die for people who already abandoned you, just to prove a point, or is staying alive more important than pride? Second, if Christian or Kevin came crawling back a year later, genuinely sorry and broken, should Frank forgive them? Or are some betrayals unforgivable? Drop your honest answers below. I'm reading every comment, and I really need to know where you stand on this.